Yesterday, something happened no one saw coming. The city hummed under neon lights, the kind that never sleep, that never forgive. A sudden chill moved through the streets, slipping past the tourists, past the cameras, past the officials who thought they knew what was coming. Inside a grand hall, the walls whispered with the echoes of power. Someone cleared their throat, but the world wasn't listening. Not yet. Trump stepped up to the podium. Not with a smile. Not with a calculated pose. But with that familiar weight, the weight of someone who has played the game and knows the stakes are higher than they appear. The microphones caught his voice first, sharp, measured, almost casual. And then the room shifted. A subtle tremor, like the floor beneath everyone's feet suddenly remembered gravity. "Something you didn't see," he said. "Something that changes everything. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight?" Journalists leaned forward. Phones were raised. Cameras clicked. But the moment was already heavier than the words. It wasn't about the revelation itself. It was about what it meant, a network of secrets stretching back decades, a web no one dared touch, until now. Outside, the streets buzzed with the oblivious rhythm of life. Taxis honked, neon reflected in puddles, and somewhere a dog barked. But inside that room, history paused. Every eye turned toward the man speaking, not because of curiosity, but because they sensed the fracture before it appeared. The fracture in power. The fracture in trust. The announcement was simple. Yet simple words sometimes carry the weight of mountains. Epstein was just the beginning, he said. Gasps. Stifled laughter. Nervous murmurs. And then, silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It vibrates. It presses against your chest. It says, without saying, watch closely, because the rules just changed. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for outrage. He let it hang there, like smoke curling toward a ceiling that can't hold it. And then he leaned forward. Eyes scanning, calculating. Not the usual bravado. Something different. Almost human. The people you trusted, he continued, the people you thought were untouchable, they were all waiting for someone to speak. Outside, life went on. But inside, decisions were being rewritten in real time. Allies glanced at each other. Enemies clenched fists. Everyone wondered, who will survive the storm that was coming? The moment was cinematic. Not in the way Hollywood fakes it. Not in glitter or smoke machines. Real tension. Real stakes. Real people staring at a truth they weren't prepared for. He paused. A beat. 2 beats. Then the final blow. The system, it is not what it seems. And in that pause, everything shifted. You could feel it in the air. A city celebrated, unaware. But something deeper was breaking. Something that would ripple far beyond the walls, far beyond the cameras, far beyond what anyone could imagine. The room emptied in whispers. Reporters typed frantically. Officials huddled in corners. And he walked out, as if leaving behind a spark, waiting for it to ignite. And that was the night America quietly changed. On the streets, neon reflected in puddles like fractured glass. People passed, laughing, arguing, scrolling. They didn't know the tremor that had just passed through the heart of their nation. Not yet. Sometimes, power isn't shown in speeches. Sometimes it's shown in the pause between words. In the way a single revelation can unsettle everything you thought was certain. Outside, lights flickered. A car alarm went off somewhere in the distance. Somewhere, someone looked at the sky and wondered if the weather was changing, or if it was just their world. And somewhere, in that same city, the watchman took notes. Quiet. Observant. Waiting for the next move. Waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. The thing about secrets is this, they never stay buried. They wait. Patient. Silent. Until someone unexpected, decides to speak. And that was when everything changed. The night stretched longer than it should have. The air smelled faintly of rain, asphalt, and electricity. Every shadow felt deeper. Every reflection felt sharper. This wasn't just news. This was a turning point. A moment that would ripple through halls of power, across dinner tables, and into the minds of people who thought they were untouchable. And outside, life kept moving. Taxis, neon, footsteps, laughter. Oblivion in motion. But inside, the spark had been lit. And sparks, once set, rarely die quietly. He wasn't born powerful. Not in the gilded halls. Not in the whispers of Washington. He was shaped by the system, by ambition, by contradiction, by a hunger no one could explain. A hunger that sometimes scared even him. The city around him felt alive, even in the dark. Neon signs hummed like arteries pumping light through concrete. Somewhere, a train screeched, a sound half machine, half scream. And he walked through it all, not as a spectator, but as someone who understood the weight of choice. Power doesn't arrive fully formed. It grows slowly, quietly, like ivy climbing a wall. It finds the cracks in ambition, in fear, in desire. And once it finds them, it spreads. He learned early that people respond to certainty. Even when certainty doesn't exist. The rules are simple: project confidence. Speak with volume. Fill the empty space with sound so no one notices the silence underneath. And yet, underneath the bravado, there was always the question: who decides what's right? He remembered the first time he saw it. Not in a courtroom. Not in a boardroom. But in a back room, faintly lit, where whispers carried more weight than contracts. A man with too much charm and too many secrets leaned close and said words that would never leave him. Everything you see is built on what no one dares to touch. He didn't understand it then. Not fully. But the seed planted itself. A curiosity. A rebellion. A recognition that the game was never fair, and that fairness, as much as people crave it, was a concept people exploited, not lived. It's easy to forget that even those at the top are human. They eat. They sleep. They doubt. They fail. And sometimes, in the quietest moment, they feel fear more sharply than anyone else. The machine, that's what some called it. The invisible web of money, influence, and secrecy. It was everywhere, yet nowhere. It thrived in shadows, in backhanded deals, in promises made in whispers. And the higher you climbed, the more you realized you weren't above it. You were part of it, or crushed by it. And that's when he decided to fight it. Not for glory. Not for applause. But because someone had to see it. Someone had to acknowledge the truth. Someone had to speak it aloud. The first moves were quiet. Small victories unnoticed. Gentle nudges that shifted the balance imperceptibly. Allies were tested. Enemies sharpened their teeth. And he learned quickly, the cost of observation is always high. The cost of action, sometimes higher. But action was necessary. Because secrecy, unchecked, becomes tyranny. And tyranny wears the mask of civility. It smiles. It shakes hands. It promises progress while hiding rot beneath the marble. He thought about Epstein. Not the scandal. Not the headlines. But the network. The connections. The shadows behind the shadows. People who believed they were untouchable because no one dared speak. Because most chose silence over truth. And yet, he remembered something his father once said, words that had settled in his mind like sediment over time. Courage isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to do what others won't. The irony was sharp. He had inherited the tools of the machine: wealth, influence, visibility. But he had also inherited its blindness. And he decided, one day, to turn that blindness into vision. Vision doesn't come neatly. It comes in flashes, in fragments. In moments where you see not just the surface, but the moving gears beneath. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That night, he sat alone, listening to the city breathe. The neon flickered. Rain tapped on the windows. Somewhere, distant, someone laughed. And he felt the weight of it all, the system, the secrets, the people who would never forgive him for exposing what they relied on to survive. The thing about humanity is this, it thrives in contradiction. We want fairness. We want security. We want truth. And yet, we tolerate lies, because lies are comfortable. Lies are safe. Lies are the blankets we wrap around ourselves to avoid the cold of reality. He felt that cold. And he chose, deliberately, to stand in it. The machine watched. Always. Quietly. Observing. Waiting for the misstep. Waiting for hesitation. Waiting for fear to betray. But he was different now. He had seen too much. And silence, that comfortable, safe silence, had lost its appeal. He remembered the first time he realized the power of a revelation. Not an accident, not a rumor, but a truth laid bare. The way it shifted people. The way it cracked confidence, reshaped priorities, and made the untouchable tremble. Power, he learned, is less about domination and more about perception. And perception can be shattered with a single word, a single disclosure, a single choice to speak when everyone else remains mute. He thought about the people caught in the machine's gears. Not the famous. Not the wealthy. But the ordinary. The overlooked. The ones whose lives were quietly, invisibly controlled by decisions made in rooms they would never see. And he realized something. Truth isn't just an idea. It's a responsibility. A burden. A tool. A weapon. And when wielded carefully, it can illuminate the darkest corners of human ambition. Some would call it recklessness. Others would call it bravery. But in the end, it was simply the only way forward. He knew the storm would come. Always comes. People resist change. Systems resist transparency. And yet, he also knew something else, even a storm can't erase a single, persistent spark. Sometimes, it takes one person to ignite it. And he had decided that person would be him. And that's when the weight of history settled on his shoulders. Not the history of presidents. Not the history of headlines. But the history of human choices, the echoes of courage and cowardice, of silence and speech, of darkness and light. And for the first time, he felt it fully. The burden of seeing. The cost of revealing. The inevitability of change. And that's when everything shifted. The city outside remained oblivious. Rain washed over asphalt. Neon reflected like fractured glass. Cars moved like ants along a grid designed for efficiency, not awareness. But inside him, clarity had arrived. Not clarity of victory. Not clarity of politics. But clarity of purpose. And sometimes, purpose is the only thing that separates those who move the world from those who are moved by it. And that was the moment he understood, the revelation wasn't just about Epstein. It was about the system. The machine. The choices everyone pretends they don't see. The truths that demand to be spoken. And that's when he decided, the silence ends now. And that's when everything changed. At first, it looked like progress. Reports came in. Tweets. Whispers in hallways. People nodded politely in meetings, smiled in public, and pretended the world hadn't shifted under their feet. But the cracks were there, small at first, almost imperceptible. A misstep here. A hesitation there. The rules were changing quietly, invisibly. Washington never sleeps. But neither does the scrutiny. Every eye turned, some calculating, some fearful, some just curious. And in that scrutiny, the machine stirred. It felt the disruption before anyone could name it. He watched it happen. Observed it like a chessboard unfolding in real time. Allies whispered promises that felt fragile. Enemies sharpened their knives behind smiles. And somewhere, the watchman, always observing, scribbled notes, connecting dots no one else dared touch. The tension wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with alarms. It moved like a shadow across the city. You felt it in glances, in delayed answers, in the subtle tremor of hands holding coffee cups in meetings that suddenly seemed too long. Inside the corridors of power, the air was heavy. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Phones went silent. Computers hummed with the dull certainty of inevitability. And everyone, from the seasoned lobbyist to the rookie aide, sensed it, the rules they lived by were bending. And bending fast. The revelation had done more than disrupt headlines. It had disrupted belief. People believed in stability, in predictability. They believed that if you played the game, followed the protocol, kept your mouth shut, you were safe. Safe was gone. He felt it in the reaction of his inner circle. Faces that had been steadfast now flickered with doubt. Voices that once carried authority now carried tension. He knew then that the machine didn't just resist change. It resented it. And it fought silently, cleverly, invisibly. The first move came as a whisper. A leak. A rumor. Something small, designed to test his reaction. But he saw it for what it was. And when he responded, the machine recoiled. For a moment, just a moment, he held the upper hand. But then came the second move. It wasn't a public attack. Not yet. It was subtler. A hesitation in the media. A question phrased to undermine. A meeting scheduled at the wrong time. The machine didn't hit hard. It hit smart. It hit in ways you wouldn't recognize until it was too late. And that's when he realized something essential: the battle wasn't against people. It was against the system itself. Against the invisible rules written in fear, in tradition, in the unspoken agreement that truth, at times, must remain hidden. Every public statement now carried weight. Every appearance was calculated. Every word was examined, dissected, and judged, not just for what it meant, but for what it could unravel. And yet, for all the pressure, for all the calculated moves against him, he stayed in motion. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. Because hiding would concede the victory to silence. And silence, he had learned, was the true enemy. The tension escalated further when allies began to question each other. Paranoia crept in quietly. Trust fractured along invisible lines. Decisions became second-guessed. And he realized that the greatest resistance often comes not from adversaries, but from the fear embedded in those closest to you. He thought about the consequences. The backlash. The political theater waiting to unfold. And he thought about the ordinary people caught in the gears, watching, waiting, hoping someone would expose the truth. The weight of their eyes pressed on him like a storm gathering at sea. In private, he heard the whispers. Not from his team. Not from the press. From those who had always benefited from the machine. Quiet warnings couched in polite language: be careful. Tread lightly. You're in over your head. And yet, he knew the truth: careful is how the machine survives. Bold is how it crumbles. So he moved forward. Each revelation, each leak he confirmed, each shadow he exposed, built tension not just in Washington, but across the nation. People felt it in subtle ways. A conversation paused awkwardly. A handshake lingered too long. An eyebrow raised just so. The tension spread like ripples across water. The first televised debate after the announcement was electric. Every question felt weighted, every answer measured. The audience didn't know it, but the rules had shifted mid-game. And everyone was adapting, consciously or unconsciously, to a new reality where the invisible now mattered more than the visible. And then came the private messages. Leaks, unnamed sources, cryptic emails. The machine was testing him, probing for weakness, fishing for hesitation. And each time he responded, he watched the pattern emerge. Slowly. Methodically. Like a storm circling a city. It wasn't just about Trump. It was about the structure itself. The corridors of power, the whispers in hallways, the invisible agreements that kept things moving smoothly, all under threat. And in that threat, he found clarity. The tension reached its first public crescendo when a senior official, long considered untouchable, was forced to acknowledge facts no one had dared speak aloud before. Not fully. Not clearly. But enough to let the nation sense a fracture, a crack in the facade of certainty. And the nation reacted, not with chaos. Not with immediate understanding. But with a deep, subtle shift. Conversations changed. Trust fractured. The quiet murmurs of disbelief grew louder. And he knew, the machine had been disrupted. And it would retaliate. The question was never who won. The question was who decided what winning means. Because in a system built on secrecy, perception is power. And every move, every word, every revelation altered not just perception, but reality itself. Outside the spotlight, the tension grew. Lobbyists calculated, advisors advised, and the watchmen observed. The machine didn't strike openly. It had never needed to. Subtlety is more effective than force. Fear, once seated, spreads quietly. And the cracks deepened. Even the public, mostly unaware of the true story, began to sense it. Something in the air, something in the cadence of the news, something in the way power shifted imperceptibly from one hand to another. And he realized, in that quiet moment alone, that tension was more powerful than revelation. Because tension lingers. Tension shapes decisions. Tension leaves traces no one can fully erase. The machine, for all its influence, had never faced someone who embraced tension, who moved through it with clarity instead of fear. And that, he understood, was his advantage. But advantage comes at a cost. Every step forward risks miscalculation. Every word carries consequences. And every revelation, no matter how truthful, fractures lives along the way. The tension was no longer just political. It was human. It was emotional. It was inevitable. And in that inevitability, he moved. Carefully. Deliberately. Like a conductor guiding an orchestra where every instrument has a mind of its own. And that is when the cracks became visible. Not just in the system, but in the people. Doubt. Paranoia. Hesitation. Moments when allies faltered. Moments when enemies smiled too easily. Moments when silence screamed louder than words. And the question lingered in the air, who truly controls the machine? Because power, in its purest form, is never given. It is seized, resisted, manipulated, and occasionally, destroyed. And that's when he knew, the tension wasn't temporary. It was the new normal. And the new normal would decide everything. What looked like freedom was dependency. He had learned that the machine doesn't fail. It can't. Not in the way people imagine. It was built this way, intricate, invisible, self-sustaining. And only when someone knew the angles, the pressures, the silent agreements, could they begin to see how it truly moved. The corridors of influence were lined not with velvet, but with compromise. Not with law, but with expectation. Every handshake carried weight. Every smile, calculation. Every promise, unspoken debt. He saw it first in documents no one thought mattered. Contracts buried under layers of legalese. Emails that seemed trivial. financial transactions that moved quietly across continents. And in those small things, he traced a pattern: web connecting people, power, and secrecy. It wasn't about Epstein alone. Epstein was a node, a signal, a single strand in a network designed to maintain itself. And that network? It was ruthless. Invisible. Almost impossible to touch unless you understood its rhythm. He had the rhythm. Every meeting became a puzzle. Every phone call, a test. And he began to map it, carefully, like an archaeologist uncovering a civilization buried beneath centuries of sediment. The patterns were unmistakable: influence traded for silence, favors exchanged for loyalty, and fear distributed quietly, methodically, among those who might resist. He realized something Americans rarely acknowledge: power doesn't exist where you can see it. It exists in the spaces between. In the pauses, the hesitations, the secrets no one dares speak aloud. The reporters saw the surface. They saw the headlines. But he saw the machine beneath the surface, moving quietly, impervious to outrage, impervious to morality. And in seeing it, he understood how few people truly grasped reality. The revelation he had announced wasn't about facts alone. It was about the structure itself. The architecture of influence. And once people caught a glimpse, the panic began to spread. People always underestimate what they cannot touch. And yet, the more he traced the web, the more he realized that the machine was predictable, not in the ways of morality, but in the ways of survival. It clings. It adapts. It hides. And when threatened, it reacts with quiet ferocity. One night, in a dimly lit office, he traced another connection. Another document. Another email thread that linked the untouchable to those who should have been untouchable. And in that moment, he saw it, the skeleton of power, exposed. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. It was human. Full of greed, fear, and fragile egos. And yet, it worked. Beautifully, horrifyingly. Like a clock, precise and relentless. He thought about the ordinary citizens who had no idea the cogs turning above them controlled their lives in subtle ways. The laws they obeyed. The systems they trusted. The media they consumed. All influenced, all nudged, all bent by forces they never saw. He realized the truth about secrecy: it doesn't just protect the guilty. It controls the innocent. It shapes behavior, molds expectation, teaches obedience. And those who benefit most rarely acknowledge it, because their survival depends on the illusion that nothing controls them. And that's when he made the choice. Not the first choice. Not the last. But a deliberate, conscious decision: to speak, to reveal, to let the public see not just the scandal, but the machinery that allowed it to exist. It wasn't simple. Nothing like this ever is. Every step required strategy, patience, understanding the pulse of every player in the room, every voice on the phone, every document that could be weaponized against him. And still, he pushed forward. Because the world deserves more than half-truths. The world deserves to see the gears, even if seeing them makes people uncomfortable. The first person to react visibly to the reveal was an old ally. A seasoned operative, the kind who has navigated Washington for decades without leaving a scratch on their reputation. Their eyes widened, not in fear, but in recognition. He understood. The web was unraveling. Slowly, methodically, inevitably. And yet, the machine doesn't collapse quietly. It retaliates. Not with fanfare, but with subtlety. With manipulation. With influence redirected, allegiances shifted, and loyalty tested. Every small victory must be defended, or it will be taken away. That was the lesson. Truth alone is never enough. The machine respects only persistence, audacity, and precision. Speak once, you may be ignored. Speak twice, you may be challenged. Speak 3 times, you are a threat. And so, he spoke. Again and again. With clarity. With evidence. With timing. The network began to falter. The cracks widened. And even as the news cycles spun, even as pundits argued, even as journalists speculated, the underlying reality became undeniable: there is a system that operates regardless of law, morality, or public scrutiny. And it had been revealed. But revelation is dangerous. It illuminates shadows, but it also draws attention from those who prefer the shadows remain. And that danger, he understood fully. He thought about the cost. Not to himself, to the people caught unknowingly in the web. To families. To careers. To the ordinary citizens whose lives were nudged, manipulated, and controlled without their knowledge. This was the moral weight of the reveal: knowledge does not liberate immediately. Knowledge awakens responsibility. Knowledge challenges comfort. Knowledge makes people act, or tremble. And he had given them that knowledge. The machine responded, predictably. Lawsuits filed quietly. Media narratives redirected. Allies reminded of loyalty in subtle ways. Threats whispered in corners. And through it all, he remained steadfast, documenting, observing, moving. Like a general on a battlefield others cannot see, orchestrating the collapse of invisible structures. The truth, once revealed, cannot be unrevealed. And the public began to notice. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to sense change. Enough to feel that the rules they assumed were fixed had shifted. Enough to realize that some truths, once spoken, can never be ignored. The moment was cinematic. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was human. Because it revealed what many suspected, but few understood. Because it exposed the machinery behind power, the choices behind influence, and the fragile threads holding systems together. And in that human clarity, he found purpose renewed. Because revelation, he realized, is not victory. It is opportunity. Opportunity to rebuild. Opportunity to confront. Opportunity to witness the human condition in its most raw, unguarded form. The machine was watching. Always. It would adapt, pivot, respond. But now it had to respond in the open. And that gave him leverage, insight, and understanding no one else possessed. What looked like chaos was actually order, the order of consequences catching up to design. And in that order, he moved. Carefully. Deliberately. Stepping through shadows, illuminating truths, and mapping the terrain of power in ways no one else dared. The reveal was complete. The network exposed. The machine forced to bend in response. And yet, even as the public cheered, debated, and questioned, he knew, this was only the beginning. The real challenge was what came next. The truth had been revealed. But could humanity handle it? Could the system survive it? Could those in power adapt without destroying everything around them? The questions hung in the air like smoke. Thick. Inescapable. Persistent. And he knew, as all who have seen the machine from the inside know, that seeing is only the first step. Acting on it, surviving it, and using it wisely is the challenge that follows. And sometimes, seeing the truth is more terrifying than any lie. And that's when he realized, what looked like freedom had been a test all along. And in that realization, the storm began to gather. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. The city was quiet, unnaturally quiet. Neon lights flickered against wet asphalt. A distant siren wailed, a lonely voice echoing through streets unprepared for the chaos rising in hearts and minds. Inside the halls of power, it was anything but quiet. Emails flew. Phones buzzed. Meetings were rescheduled at impossible hours. Allies whispered. Enemies calculated. And through it all, he stood, observing, weighing, moving with the precision of someone who understood that the storm wasn't coming, it had arrived. It started subtly. The media caught wind of the cracks and painted them as routine political maneuvering. But those who watched closely knew the difference. This wasn't politics as usual. This was a reckoning. A reckoning built over decades, fueled by secrecy, greed, and the quiet consent of those who believed silence would protect them. He felt it in his chest. That pressure, heavy, insistent, reminding him that revelation carries consequences. Every choice has a ripple. Every word spoken reshapes reality. And every silence left unbroken strengthens the machine. He thought of Epstein. Not as a scandal, not as a headline, but as a symptom. A signal. A thread connecting countless lives in ways no one truly comprehended. And now that thread had been pulled. The web trembled. And tremors spread quickly through the structures of power, shaking everything from the top down. The storm had no single face. No lightning to admire. No thunder to fear. It was in the subtle, relentless pressure, in the gnawing tension that grew in the minds of those who thought themselves untouchable. It was in the quiet panic of long-held alliances that began to crumble under the weight of exposure. He felt the storm inside himself, too. Not fear, not entirely. Something deeper. Something human. The realization that the world he knew, the rules he had once accepted, were no longer reliable. That morality, law, influence, all were far more fragile than anyone admits. The storm doesn't strike equally. Some feel the winds, others feel the rain. He felt both. And in that awareness, he found clarity. Clarity isn't comfort. It isn't relief. It is understanding. And understanding can be as isolating as it is empowering. And then came the pushback. Predictable, precise, unavoidable. The machine flexed. Whispers turned into accusations. Allies questioned loyalty. Officials maneuvered for advantage. Every revelation he had unleashed now returned, sharpened, in ways he could anticipate but could not fully control. The storm tested him. Not in public, but in private. Not in the headlines, but in the quiet moments between decisions. Every reflection forced a choice: act, retreat, or risk everything. And each choice carried a weight greater than any single human could bear alone. Some nights, he couldn't sleep. The hum of the city outside his window reminded him that life goes on. That rain will fall, that neon will flicker, that people will walk through streets oblivious to the storms shaping their world. But inside him, the storm raged. Decisions spun endlessly in loops. What was right? What was necessary? What was human? The storm forced him to see the fragility of trust. The precarious balance of influence. The invisible cords tying everyone, willingly or not, to consequences no one fully understands until they break. And yet, in that storm, he also saw possibility. Not triumph, not victory, but a glimpse of something profound. That courage, once chosen, spreads. That truth, once revealed, persists. That the human heart, confronted with revelation, can respond with integrity or cowardice, and history will note the difference. The storm has no morality, but it reveals character. And character, he realized, is forged precisely in moments like this. Moments of discomfort. Moments of risk. Moments when silence is easier than speaking, and speaking could change everything. He thought of the ordinary people, the ones watching from outside the halls of power, unaware of the intricacies, yet affected nonetheless. How fragile their trust could be. How powerful revelation could feel. And he understood that this storm was bigger than any individual. Bigger than politics. Bigger than headlines. It was about humanity. It was about choice. The first crack appeared publicly when a long-standing ally, previously unwavering, questioned the validity of the disclosures. Not openly. Not with aggression. but in subtle, pointed ways that suggested uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than fire. The machine responded with familiar elegance, diversion, obfuscation, intimidation. A single leak here. A planted story there. A gesture that seemed polite but carried the weight of threat. All designed to erode confidence, to slow momentum, to test resolve. And yet, he did not yield. He could feel the storm battering him, threatening to bend him, to push him into retreat. But retreat is a luxury afforded to those who cannot see the machinery of deception for what it is. He could see it. And that vision gave him strength. The storm grew more personal. Friends questioned motives. Enemies strategized with precision. Media narratives shifted hourly. Every move he made was analyzed, dissected, turned into propaganda or praised as brilliance, depending on the observer. And in that pressure, he realized a truth few understand: the external storm is only half the battle. The inner storm, fear, doubt, uncertainty, is the real crucible. He faced it directly. And in facing it, he found calm. Not comfort. Not certainty. But clarity. The storm, he understood, is inevitable. The storm is necessary. The storm reveals the unspoken, exposes the hidden, illuminates the shadowed corners of the human heart. And so he moved. Step by step. Decision by decision. Revealing the hidden truths. Enduring the backlash. Observing the machine respond. Waiting, always waiting, for the moment when courage meets consequence, when revelation meets accountability, when humanity meets the reckoning it has long avoided. The storm doesn't forgive. It doesn't wait. It doesn't care. And yet, in that chaos, he realized a profound human truth: storms do not last forever. They pass. They shape. They leave marks. And in their wake, opportunity emerges. He thought about the phrase whispered by his father long ago. Storms pass. The question is what you carry afterward. He understood it now. Fully. And in that understanding, the emotional apex arrived. Not triumph. Not victory. But awakening. A human recognition that life, power, and morality are intertwined, fragile, and demanding. And that courage, genuine, uncalculated, unglorified, is the only thing that can navigate the storm intact. He paused. The city hummed outside. Neon reflected in puddles like fragmented mirrors. Rain fell softly. Somewhere, a siren wailed, then faded. Silence pressed against the night. And then, silence spoke louder. Because storms leave echoes. Not just in the world, but inside the people who survive them. Inside those who witness them. Inside those who choose to act when most remain still. The storm had arrived. It had battered, bruised, exposed. And yet, in its wake, the human heart could find clarity. The mind could find understanding. And the spirit could find resolve. And in that storm, he realized something no headline could capture: truth is not a destination. Truth is the decision to stand when all else falls apart. And that is the moment America saw not just a revelation, but a reckoning. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's passed down. One brave choice at a time. The city outside had returned to its rhythm. Neon lights hummed, taxis rolled past, distant laughter floated in alleys. Life continued. Unaware. Indifferent. But inside hearts, inside minds, something lingered. A quiet shift, like the subtle turning of the tide, a recognition that the world is never quite the same once truth has been seen. He walked through the quiet streets, feeling the pulse of the city beneath his feet. Rain had washed the asphalt clean, leaving reflections of neon like fractured stars scattered across concrete. In that mirrored light, he saw the choices, the sacrifices, the courage required not to bend, not to hide, not to compromise. He thought of the people who had been caught in the web, the invisible network of influence that had governed lives with precision and quiet cruelty. They would go home tonight, perhaps unaware of the storms above, yet subtly altered, carrying a new understanding of what it means to confront truth. The machine had responded, as expected. Adjustments made. Shadows shifted. Secrets buried deeper. But the light, the revelation, the human courage to speak, remained. That was the gift. That was the power. He remembered the words whispered in back rooms, the lessons passed down from those who had navigated similar storms before him. Change does not announce itself. It creeps quietly, leaving those who resist behind. And in the creeping quiet, he found hope. Not the naive hope of children, not the fleeting hope of the powerless, but the steady, resolute hope that emerges when you see what must be done and do it anyway. It was the moment when reflection meets responsibility. When calm replaces chaos. When silence becomes not fear, but understanding. He paused at a corner, watching the city breathe. Steam rose from a grate, curling into the night like a memory refusing to fade. A taxi honked. Somewhere, a bar door slammed. Somewhere, laughter rang out. Life, in all its chaos and beauty, continued. And in that continuity, he saw the essence of humanity. Imperfect. Fragile. Persistent. Defiant. He thought about what it means to stand for truth. Not for applause. Not for headlines. Not for victory. But because it is necessary. Because it is right. Because courage, once chosen, ripples outward in ways impossible to measure. The night had been long. The storm had raged. But the human heart endures. And in enduring, it finds light. He looked up at the sky, dark and infinite above the neon glow. Stars hidden by city lights, yet still present. Always present. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting to guide. Freedom is like that. Always present. Sometimes hidden. Sometimes obscured. But waiting for someone to recognize it, claim it, and carry it forward. And he thought about the moments that had led to this, the whispers in corridors, the careful observations, the courage to speak when others would not. Each moment, a choice. Each choice, a spark. And together, they created illumination in a world accustomed to darkness. He remembered the ordinary faces affected by revelation. The mothers. The fathers. The children who would inherit a world slightly more aware than before. Not perfect. Not just. But freer than it was yesterday. And in that reflection, he understood something essential: power is transient. Systems shift. Machines adapt. But human courage endures. It echoes. It inspires. It transforms. He thought about the story as it would be told in years to come. Not the headlines. Not the controversies. But the truth. The human truth. The courage, the fear, the choice to act. That is what history remembers. That is what endures. And he realized, this was not the end. The storm would return. The machine would regroup. Challenges would persist. But the light, once seen, could not be hidden. It travels. Quietly. Patiently. Relentlessly. And so, he walked. Not in triumph. Not in glory. Not in vengeance. But in quiet determination. A recognition that life demands vigilance, that courage is required daily, that freedom, though fragile, is worth every sacrifice. He paused again, listening to the city. The distant hum of neon. Footsteps on wet pavement. The faint whisper of wind through alleys. And he knew, the story is never truly complete. It unfolds with each choice, each decision, each act of human bravery. And in that realization, he whispered to himself, and to the world. So when your moment comes, what will you stand for? Because history, like life, is written not by inevitability, but by choice. By courage. By those willing to face the storm, endure the tension, reveal truth, and embrace the consequences. And in the quiet reflection of night, he understood another truth: the human spirit is a light that cannot be extinguished, only dimmed. And every spark matters. Every voice matters. Every brave act matters. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The morning after was quiet, but nothing was the same. People went to work. Cars moved through streets. Coffee steamed in mugs held tight. Life appeared normal. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Conversations had changed. Glances lingered longer. Doubts and suspicions bubbled beneath smiles. The headlines screamed one story, but anyone paying attention could see another: a system rattled, a machine unsettled, a city that believed it controlled its destiny realizing it never did. He watched it unfold from a high-rise office, sunlight cutting through blinds like judgment. The screen in front of him displayed news updates, live feeds, commentary, all attempting to narrate what was happening. But none of it captured the undercurrent, the subtle tremor that ran through power, influence, and trust. People reacted as humans always do. Some clutched their beliefs tighter. Some panicked quietly. Some saw the cracks and smiled with cautious optimism. And a few, the smallest number, understood the full weight of the revelation, that the world they had relied on for order was not what it seemed. The first shockwaves came from the politicians. Allies, who had once nodded in agreement behind closed doors, now paused before answering questions. They rephrased statements. They measured their words. Every syllable carried risk. Every hesitation was observed. And enemies, predictably, seized opportunity. They maneuvered subtly. Tweets written with double meaning. Public appearances designed to unsettle. Messages sent with invisible strings attached. Power, like water, finds the cracks, and in this moment, those cracks were everywhere. The media responded with the frenzy of a city suddenly aware of unseen threats. Headlines screamed, debates raged, and panels argued endlessly about morality, legality, and influence. But for those who understood the system, the spectacle was superficial. The truth moved quietly, invisibly, under the surface, like an underground river cutting through stone. And the public? They noticed the change in tone before they understood the change in reality. Something had shifted, even if they couldn't name it. Conversations about corruption, secrecy, and accountability filtered into everyday life. People questioned, quietly, the structures they had always taken for granted. He observed all of it with careful distance. Not detachment, never detachment, but with awareness. Understanding that the storm may have passed in its loudest form, but the aftermath would linger, subtle and relentless, reshaping decisions and alliances for months, maybe years. The first internal reaction from the machine came not as a headline or a leak, but as whispers. Warnings couched in politeness. Gentle pressure applied through connections, influence, and obligation. The system tested him, probing for weakness, exploring the limits of his endurance. But he had learned the rhythm. The machine moved predictably. It flexed, it adapted, it hid. And he knew how to respond, carefully, deliberately, with clarity. The tension, however, was far from over. Public opinion became a battleground. Social media churned with outrage, disbelief, and speculation. The narrative fractured into countless streams, each seeking to dominate perception. People argued passionately about morality, legality, and accountability. But beneath it all, the same fundamental truth persisted: the machine had been exposed, and exposure cannot be erased. He thought about the ordinary people caught in the aftermath. Those who had trusted systems that now seemed fragile. Those who had believed that rules existed for fairness, only to discover they were tools of control. Fear, curiosity, hope, and skepticism intertwined, creating a complex tapestry of human emotion he had to navigate. Meanwhile, insiders calculated. Meetings behind closed doors assessed the damage. Strategies were rewritten. Policies delayed. Alliances reconsidered. And through it all, he remained a constant, both observer and participant, shaping outcomes by understanding the invisible currents of influence. Even allies who remained loyal were tested. The pressure revealed cracks in trust. Subtle doubts arose, subtle questions whispered in confidence. And in those moments, he realized an enduring truth: when power is exposed, even loyalty is fragile. But fragility can be managed. Fragility can be guided. And in guiding it, he could shape the aftermath. The first notable public acknowledgement of the storm's impact came in a statement carefully measured to balance concern, authority, and denial. Its language was precise, but even the carefully chosen words revealed anxiety. It was a subtle admission that the system, for all its strength, had been disrupted. And disruption is always uncomfortable. Across the city, people noticed the cracks. Conversations in offices, cafes, and homes hinted at awareness long before full understanding arrived. The invisible river had surfaced. Currents moved faster now, and those attuned could sense where influence had shifted, where power had faltered, and where opportunity waited. He thought of the lessons embedded in the aftermath. Change is never sudden. It arrives quietly, shaping perception, molding behavior, and forcing humans to confront truths they might prefer to ignore. The real work begins after the storm. The reflection, adaptation, and decisions that define the next era. He paused to reflect on his own position. Not victory. Not triumph. But responsibility. The burden of knowledge. The awareness of consequence. And the understanding that the aftermath, as subtle as it appeared, was a crucible. And crucibles reveal character. Character in public, character in private, character in the quiet moments of decision. And the choices made in the aftermath determine how history will remember the storm, and those who navigated it. The night fell again, slower this time. The neon glow softer after the sun had set, casting longer shadows, reminding everyone that light and darkness are never separate. They coexist. And in their coexistence lies clarity. The aftermath is not just a reflection of what occurred. It is a test of humanity. The system may rebuild. Influence may reassert itself. Secrets may be buried deeper. But courage, once demonstrated, cannot be undone. Truth, once revealed, endures. And people, in their own time, respond, some with bravery, some with silence, some with complicity. And as he observed the city, the shifting alliances, the subtle recalibration of power, he understood another truth: the storm was only the beginning. The revelation created ripples that would expand, intersect, and alter the trajectory of countless lives. And the aftereffects would shape not just headlines, but the human condition itself. He walked the quiet streets, listening to footsteps, the hum of neon, the distant echo of conversation. Life continued, oblivious in some ways, aware in others. And in that continuity, he found hope, not loud, not flashy, but steady, enduring, persistent. The aftermath demands reflection. Demands courage. Demands vigilance. And in this reflection, he glimpsed the possibilities for what could emerge: a more conscious society, a more aware public, and individuals who, having seen the storm, might act differently than before. Because the story, he realized, is never just about scandal. It is about humanity. About choices. About courage. About the quiet decisions that ripple outward into history. And in that quiet, reflective moment, he whispered to himself, and to anyone listening: if this story made you think, share it. Because truth survives only when it's told. And maybe, he thought, the aftermath is the truest test of all. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Not just headlines. Not just tweets, but whispers in offices, cafes, and living rooms across the country. People spoke cautiously at first, unsure of what they'd heard, reluctant to believe what seemed impossible. And then, slowly, the conversation grew louder. It was in the questions asked at dinner tables. In the awkward silences at work. In the sudden awareness that nothing was as fixed as they had assumed. The revelation hadn't just shaken power, it had shaken perception. And perception shapes reality. Some felt fear. The ordinary citizen, unaware of hidden mechanisms, suddenly confronted the fragility of the world around them. Contracts they had trusted, institutions they had revered, leaders they had believed in, all now seemed vulnerable, imperfect, fallible. And that realization unsettled more than it inspired. Others felt hope. A small, stubborn hope, like a candle flickering in a drafty room. That perhaps, if the machine could be exposed, if the web of influence could be illuminated, then ordinary people could reclaim agency, if only slightly. That truth, once acknowledged, might ripple outward and inspire accountability. And yet, the majority felt confusion. A quiet, pervasive confusion that settles in the stomach and the mind alike. People argued about morality. About law. About what is right. About what is possible. And in that confusion, the system adapted again, hiding its most dangerous edges while presenting a softer, more palatable face. He observed it all from a distance. Not detachment, but awareness. The way people respond to revelation is always telling, it exposes character, fear, and aspiration. He saw conversations held in hushed tones, debates that grew heated and personal, and private realizations that never reached the public sphere. Schools, offices, and social groups became microcosms of the larger upheaval. Students whispered about accountability, fairness, and integrity. Employees questioned leaders quietly, gauging whether authority deserved their loyalty. Families reconsidered stories they had always told about the world, stories of stability, of justice, of safety. And everywhere, the echo of the storm remained. People who had not lived it directly felt it indirectly, through fear, curiosity, hope, and anger. The revelation spread not just through news cycles, but through human consciousness itself. He realized then a truth often overlooked: societal change begins in the small, almost imperceptible shifts. Not in protests alone, not in rallies, not in speeches, but in the questions whispered quietly, the doubts allowed to surface, the private moments when people confront reality as it is, not as they wish it to be. The machine responded again. Adaptation is its strength. Influence redirected. Narratives adjusted. Strategic silence. Calculated noise. Subtle intimidation. And yet, even as it flexed, he noticed something remarkable: people were no longer entirely blind. They could see the patterns, even if partially. And that sight, however incomplete, was dangerous to the machine. Public discourse evolved rapidly. Social media became both a tool and a battlefield. Debates spiraled into philosophical territory. Ordinary citizens demanded transparency, not just from headlines but from systems they relied upon daily: law enforcement, courts, financial institutions, elected officials. People wanted understanding, accountability, and truth. And in that collective demand, the seeds of change were planted. But he also saw the cost. Anxiety rose. Trust eroded. Friends and neighbors argued over morality, loyalty, and perspective. Families fractured quietly over differing interpretations of events. Some retreated into denial, others pushed forward with conviction. The societal ripples weren't uniform, they were chaotic, unpredictable, human. The most fascinating moments were the small ones. A teacher addressing a classroom, cautiously introducing the idea that systems can fail. A parent quietly correcting misinformation at the dinner table. A coworker choosing to speak up in a meeting where silence had once ruled. These were the first signs that the storm had penetrated ordinary life. That revelation, once thought to be contained to headlines and power corridors, had entered the bloodstream of society itself. He thought about how fragile this process was. One misstep. One failure to communicate. One retreat into cynicism, and the opportunity could be lost. The machine, though shaken, remained formidable. Subtle influence, fear, and compliance are harder to overcome than outright corruption. And yet, in the interplay between revelation and response, he saw hope. Not the sweeping hope of immediate justice, but the slow, deliberate hope that awareness creates. Awareness leads to conversation. Conversation leads to scrutiny. Scrutiny leads to accountability. And accountability, even imperfectly applied, changes the landscape of human behavior. Communities began to reflect. Not in grand gestures, but in subtle shifts. Meetings were more honest. Leaders were questioned more thoroughly. Individuals reconsidered ethical choices. And in each small action, the aftereffects of the revelation traveled further, reshaping norms, influencing culture, and challenging complacency. And in this quiet reflection, he saw the profound truth: societal transformation begins not in chaos, but in consciousness. In the moments when ordinary people pause, consider, and choose differently. He observed how fear and hope coexisted, intertwined, and drove human behavior. The revelation had not simplified life. It had complicated it, demanded reflection, courage, and moral clarity. And in that complexity, the human spirit revealed its resilience. The machine, while powerful, now faced a population partially awakened. It could no longer operate with absolute invisibility. Its edges were exposed, its vulnerabilities apparent. And exposure invites response, scrutiny, and action. Yet, he also understood that awareness is not victory. Not yet. Awareness is the first step. The ripple that becomes wave only if sustained, only if human courage is maintained, only if vigilance endures. The city outside continued, unaware in some ways, aware in others. Neon reflected in puddles like fractured mirrors, illustrating the fragmented understanding of the population. Some pieces reflected fear. Some reflected hope. Some reflected confusion. And all combined to create a living portrait of societal response. He thought about the human condition, that fragile, persistent, defiant force. People do not easily surrender to truth, nor easily ignore it. They waver. They question. They act. They hesitate. And in that wavering, questioning, acting, and hesitating, change begins. And maybe, he realized, that is the most human part of all, the ability to confront the storm, reflect on the revelation, and make choices in the face of uncertainty. He paused on a street corner. Rain had stopped. The hum of the city continued. People passed, some absorbed in phones, others walking with purpose, unknowingly participating in the evolving story. And he understood, society itself is alive, constantly reacting, recalibrating, learning. The revelation, the storm, the aftermath, they were catalysts. But the ripples through society depended on millions of small, human decisions. Each whisper, each conversation, each moment of reflection mattered. And in that understanding, he felt a quiet optimism. Not the loud optimism of celebrations or rallies. Not the fleeting optimism of media cycles. But the enduring optimism of human consciousness awakening, questioning, and slowly, deliberately, choosing. Because change, he realized, is not made by one person alone. It is made by many, quietly, persistently, with courage and reflection. And in that awakening, he whispered once more, softly, to the listener. Because awareness is the first step to transformation. Inside the halls of power, the air was thick. Not smoke. Not dust. But the weight of consequences, unspoken threats, and unanticipated exposure. Every step, every word, every glance carried meaning. And everyone knew it. The machine was real, and it was wounded. Its operators moved carefully, recalculating every strategy. Allies who had once nodded in confidence now paused, weighed their options, measured loyalty against self-preservation. Enemies sharpened their strategies, probing for weakness, exploiting hesitation. He watched it all, aware that political theater is often louder than reality. Headlines scream, pundits pontificate, public outrage simmers, but the real moves happen in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, where decisions are made, alliances shifted, and futures quietly rewritten. One meeting stood out. A long-standing insider, someone once untouchable, paced nervously. Their words were chosen, careful, rehearsed. And yet, he could see the tension beneath the polish. This was a person realizing that revelation changes power, that exposure redraws lines of influence faster than anyone can predict. Every political actor faced the same question: adapt or resist. And in adaptation, subtle truth emerged: those who cling too tightly to the old rules risk collapse, those who move too boldly risk exposure. The balance is delicate, fragile, human. He noticed the invisible signals. A pause too long before answering. A hand gesture betraying impatience. A smile masking calculation. These were the real headlines. Not printed words. Not camera flashes. Not debates. But the signals that decide who survives in corridors of influence. The media interpreted everything through narrative, often missing nuance. Spin doctors whispered to reporters, shaping the story. Politicians calculated optics. And ordinary citizens tried to make sense of it all through screens, comments, and snippets, unaware of the chessboard beneath. It was a game, but not like most imagined. Moves weren't always visible. Checkmates weren't always final. And sometimes, victory looks like compromise, while defeat looks like survival. He observed a subtle pattern. The insiders who thrived weren't necessarily the most powerful, the most ruthless, or the most ambitious. They were the most adaptable. The most patient. The ones who understood the rhythm of consequence and the weight of exposure. One quiet day, a senator, someone long considered untouchable, called a private meeting. Their voice was calm, measured, but each sentence carried pressure. The message was clear: the landscape has shifted, and choices must align with the new reality. Resist, and risk public and private ruin. Adapt, and maintain influence, perhaps at the cost of some principles. And that, he realized, is the essence of politics exposed: power is fragile, morality negotiable, and perception everything. The chessboard extends beyond the visible players, into every conversation, every media cycle, every silent calculation in the hearts of those who wield influence. He reflected on the human side of it. Those in power are not mere caricatures of ambition. They are human beings, flawed, scared, courageous, selfish, selfless, calculating, compassionate. And when the machine trembles, their humanity becomes visible in ways it rarely does. The tension escalated further when internal communications leaked, a few small emails, strategically chosen, igniting suspicion. Alliances shifted. Trust eroded. Calculations accelerated. And through it all, he remained a constant observer, navigating the currents, predicting movement, understanding consequences. Some insiders panicked. Some strategized with elegance. And some chose silence, waiting to see how others moved before revealing their hand. The chessboard was alive, moving in subtle, invisible waves, and he could read it, anticipating shifts others could not. The broader public watched partially, unaware of the depth, yet responding instinctively. Protest signs appeared. Heated debates erupted in comment sections. Opinion polls fluctuated. People sensed imbalance and instability, even if they couldn't name the structures behind it. And in that chaos, philosophy revealed itself: power is temporary, perception is fragile, and human choice remains the only constant. The chessboard is merely a reflection of these truths. He saw moments of brilliance and moments of cowardice. A whisper here saving a career. A hesitation there ending a promise. In the quiet, the game of politics unfolded like a living organism, each decision shaping the next, each action measured against the weight of consequence. He reflected on history, understanding that the most enduring leaders are not those who dominate headlines or intimidate rivals. They are those who navigate turbulence with clarity, adapt with patience, and act with awareness of human consequence. And yet, the political storm had consequences that extended beyond the halls of power. Policies stalled. Legislation delayed. Decisions postponed. Ordinary people felt ripples, often without understanding the origin. Life, subtly altered, bore witness to decisions made in rooms few could enter. The philosophical question lingered: what does it mean to act ethically when the system rewards compromise, silence, and strategic calculation? And what does it mean for the public to understand power when only fragments are visible? The chessboard was no longer hidden. Its pieces were now visible to some, its strategy partially revealed. But visibility doesn't equal understanding, and understanding demands courage. Courage to question, courage to act, courage to face consequences that might extend beyond the self. He realized at this moment, the aftermath of revelation, the storm subsiding, society adjusting, and the political chessboard reshaping, was an inflection point. A pivot where humanity could observe itself, reflect, and potentially evolve. And yet, as always, there was uncertainty. Some pieces would fall. Some alliances would fracture. Some truths would be distorted or forgotten. And through it all, the lesson persisted: power is transient, influence is conditional, and human character is the only enduring constant. He paused, watching the city from a high vantage point. Traffic flowed like veins, lights glimmered like stars caught in concrete. Inside the city, decisions were being made. Outside, life continued. Everywhere, consequences of the chessboard spread quietly, shaping reality in subtle ways. The human dimension of power is rarely acknowledged. People think of politics as strategy, as competition. Rarely do they consider that it is, at its core, a reflection of human choice, courage or fear, honesty or deceit, action or inaction. And in this reflection, he found a kind of clarity. The chessboard is endless. The game is ongoing. Players come and go. But the lessons remain. Adaptability, awareness, courage, these are the pieces that endure when all else shifts. And maybe, he thought, that is the most human part of all, even in a system built to hide truth, manipulate perception, and concentrate power, human choice remains the ultimate wild card. The game continues. Moves will be made. Consequences will follow. And ordinary people, the silent observers, the audience to history unfolding, will participate in ways both visible and unseen. He whispered again, softly, almost to himself. History remembers the choices we dare to make. And in that quiet acknowledgement, the political chessboard, complex and relentless, revealed its human heart. She woke up to the sound of rain tapping against her window. Not violent. Not urgent. Just steady. Rhythmic. Almost meditative. But today, the sound carried weight. News alerts had flooded her phone. Conversations at work lingered in her mind. And the realization settled slowly: the world she had trusted, the rules she had accepted, were not what they seemed. Her first thought was fear. A small, gnawing fear that maybe stability had been an illusion. That certainty was fragile. That her life, and the lives of those she loved, were entangled in systems she didn't fully understand. Then came curiosity. The kind that awakens in the quietest moments, when no one is watching, when reflection surfaces like a tide pushing against a familiar shore. She wanted to understand. To see the mechanisms, to trace the ripple effects, to comprehend the consequences that political chessboards and societal shifts could have on her day-to-day life. Across the city, he felt the same tremor. Not fear, not anxiety, but awareness. A recognition that the revelation, the storm, and the political aftershocks were not distant abstractions. They were here, now, shaping personal realities, demanding reflection, and testing human resolve. People she knew began to change subtly. A coworker once quiet now questioned decisions more boldly. A friend who had always deferred to authority now spoke up. A neighbor who rarely engaged in civic matters began to research, to verify, to understand. Small, almost imperceptible shifts, but meaningful. It was in these small shifts that the human impact of the revelation became visible. Not in headlines, not in pundit commentary, not in political strategy, but in choices made quietly, in conversations held carefully, in the courage to acknowledge uncertainty and act despite it. Her story intertwined with millions of others. Each person processing, questioning, adapting. Ordinary lives subtly altered by extraordinary events. Decisions previously taken for granted now required thought. Assumptions challenged. Perspectives expanded. And yet, there was still doubt. Still hesitation. Still the weight of consequence pressing gently, insistently, on human shoulders. Every choice carried risk. Every question had potential cost. Courage is never comfortable. Awareness is never easy. At the local diner, a retired teacher read the morning paper and shook his head. He had lived through scandals, through political upheaval, through moments when the system seemed broken beyond repair. And yet, he felt something different now. Not despair. Not hope exactly. But recognition, that human choice still mattered. That integrity, courage, and accountability could ripple through society if enough people dared to act. A young journalist at a nearby table tapped her fingers against her notebook, contemplating her role. What stories to tell? Which truths to illuminate? How to navigate the currents of influence and perception without losing sight of ethics? Her curiosity was tinged with fear, but also with determination. The revelation demanded something from everyone, and she was ready to respond. These stories, small and large, mundane and profound, formed a tapestry. A living, breathing portrait of how revelation intersects with humanity. It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just headlines. It was people navigating their lives, their work, their families, their choices, within a world suddenly more visible, more complex, more fragile. He understood something essential in these moments. History is made not just by leaders, systems, or scandals, but by human reaction. By the countless individual decisions that shape perception, culture, and collective consciousness. One person questioning. One person choosing honesty. One person refusing complacency. That is how change travels. She walked through the city streets later that day. Rain had stopped. Puddles reflected neon signs, fractured like mirrors of awareness. She noticed how people moved differently. Some hurried, some hesitant, some contemplative. The revelation had touched everyone in subtle ways, and she felt part of that shift, a participant in the unfolding story. Her friend called, voice shaky, asking questions she hadn't considered. She responded cautiously, thoughtfully. Conversation became reflection, reflection became clarity, and clarity became action. And in that simple human exchange, the aftereffects of the storm spread further. It occurred to her that courage is often quiet. Not the courage of speeches or headlines, but the courage to ask questions, to confront discomfort, to act ethically when no one is watching. That courage, multiplied across millions, is unstoppable. A factory worker in another part of the city read about the revelations and sighed. Life was already challenging. Bills, family, routine. And yet, he felt a spark, a recognition that awareness matters. That questions, even small, private ones, have the power to ripple outward. That choices, however mundane, carry consequence. Children asked questions too. At home, at school, in playgrounds. Parents paused, considered, and responded. Some answers were partial. Some were honest. Some were evasive. And through it all, the process of human reflection unfolded, shaping understanding, ethics, and conscience. He thought about the ordinary people most impacted by the storm yet least visible in headlines. Nurses, teachers, janitors, drivers, students, retirees. Their awareness, their choices, their conversations, their courage, these were the true undercurrent of societal change. They were the invisible chess pieces shifting the landscape slowly, deliberately, persistently. And the city itself bore witness. Streets, buildings, neon signs, traffic, rain-soaked concrete, all reflected the tension, the hope, the complexity of human response. Life continued, altered in small ways, but life endured. Humanity, tested, revealed its resilience. She paused at a corner, watching a mother with her child. The child's eyes reflected curiosity, innocence, and trust. The mother's expression, protective yet thoughtful, hinted at reflection and ethical consideration. In that brief interaction, the weight of societal change met the intimacy of human experience. Every personal story, he realized, was a microcosm of the larger revelation. The storm touched everyone differently. Some directly. Some indirectly. Some were inspired. Some disillusioned. Some cautious. But all were participants in the human narrative that the revelation had catalyzed. He reflected on the quiet bravery he witnessed daily. Not in public gestures or media soundbites, but in the choices made privately, ethically, consciously. That bravery, multiplied across millions, is the heartbeat of society. That courage, sustained, shapes the future more reliably than any headline or scandal. And in the final reflection of the day, she understood something profound: revelation is not just exposure. It is invitation. An invitation to see, to reflect, to choose, to act. And when ordinary people accept that invitation, history shifts, not suddenly, not always visibly, but inevitably. She whispered to herself as night fell, neon lights reflecting in puddles like scattered fragments of understanding. Every choice shapes the world we inherit. And perhaps, he thought, that is the essence of all human experience, the intersection of revelation and response, of courage and reflection, of storm and quiet understanding. The world noticed, quietly at first. Embassies in distant capitals exchanged hurried messages. Diplomats whispered in hallways. Analysts typed frantically into encrypted channels. Newsfeeds from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East carried the story like an invisible current, pulling awareness across oceans. It wasn't just a headline. It was a disruption of perception. Of trust. Of assumed order. What happened in one city, one country, one system, sent tremors through networks that thought themselves stable, untouchable, invisible. Foreign leaders observed carefully. Allies measured responses, weighing political gain against moral compromise. Adversaries watched for weakness, opportunity, leverage. Every gesture, every statement, every diplomatic note carried the weight of calculated meaning. He tracked the signals. Not the ones printed in newspapers or broadcast on television. The ones that mattered moved in private, in corridors, in encrypted messages, in subtle shifts of policy and rhetoric. That's where the real story unfolded, the invisible chessboard extended across borders. Embassies in Berlin, London, Tokyo, and Paris convened. Analysts debated implications for diplomacy, finance, trade. Not as abstract concepts, but as tangible risks. The revelation had exposed not just domestic vulnerabilities, but systemic weaknesses that resonated globally. In Asia, government officials quietly reviewed contingency plans. News outlets, careful with language, speculated but avoided outright accusation. Citizens speculated loudly online, questioning fairness, accountability, and power. A collective awareness, like a tide, began to rise. Meanwhile, a diplomat in Brussels wrote a confidential memo. Systems that appear stable are not necessarily resilient. Observation is required. Influence is shifting. Adjust strategy accordingly. And in that line, the human heart of geopolitics appeared, caution, calculation, fear, and opportunity intertwined, just as they do everywhere power exists. The ripple effect reached corporations next. Boardrooms in multinational companies discussed exposure risk. Share prices wavered slightly, reflecting perception more than reality. Legal teams consulted constantly. PR strategists reworked messaging. The world, as a network of influence, was alive, responding in real time. He observed patterns repeating globally, human behavior consistent across cultures, fear, curiosity, hope, and skepticism mingling in unpredictable ways. Leaders calibrated. Population speculated. Media amplified. And in the midst, ordinary people wondered what it meant for their lives, their work, their families. A schoolteacher in London discussed the story with her class. Sometimes, she said, what seems distant affects us more than we think. Awareness matters. Courage matters. Children listened, some puzzled, some enlightened, unaware of how much their thinking would shape future society. In Sydney, a journalist typed furiously, connecting dots, tracing patterns, revealing insights hidden beneath mainstream reporting. Her work inspired conversation, curiosity, and scrutiny, quietly influencing public understanding. Even in small towns far from capitals, citizens debated ethics, governance, and accountability. The storm, though originating in one city, had become a global lesson in human awareness, morality, and the consequences of hidden power. He reflected on the universality of human response. Regardless of language, culture, or geography, people process revelation similarly. They question. They fear. They hope. They act, often cautiously, but always meaningfully. Yet he understood the danger. Awareness, though widespread, is fragile. Complacency can return. Media cycles are short. Attention fades. And the machine, though distant in foreign lands, has its own mechanisms, capable of adaptation, obfuscation, and quiet control. In New York, back in the city of origin, he watched the global reflection ripple back home. Each international reaction subtly influenced domestic perception. Policy decisions, media framing, and public sentiment intertwined in a feedback loop, strengthening or weakening societal and political response. The chessboard of power was now multidimensional. Borders no longer contained influence. Public perception, media amplification, and human response extended in multiple directions simultaneously. Complexity increased. Risk multiplied. Opportunity emerged. And yet, human courage persisted. Whistleblowers abroad spoke quietly. Citizens questioned leaders in town halls. Analysts published insights for free, sacrificing comfort for truth. Conversations emerged that would never reach headlines but shaped understanding nonetheless. He noted the philosophical implications. Truth travels, but slowly. Influence can be global, but human awareness is personal. Systems are vast, but their weakness lies in human choice. And when courage intersects with observation, systems tremble, and change becomes possible. One small incident stood out. A diplomat in Brussels, long considered a pragmatist, leaked a document exposing internal calculations about the impact of the revelation. It was minor in content but monumental in consequence. Instantly, other actors recalibrated. Awareness spread faster than anticipated. Change, though incremental, accelerated. Across continents, he observed similar patterns. Individuals, alone or in small groups, made choices that collectively shaped perception, policy, and consequence. The storm was no longer local. It was global. Yet the human element remained central. Courage, reflection, and ethical choice determined whether awareness led to meaningful action or faded into noise. And in that observation, he found hope. Not the hope of instant justice. Not the hope of swift resolution. But enduring hope, that awareness, when multiplied, when acted upon, when reflected in human courage, can reshape systems, even ones designed to resist exposure. He paused on a rooftop at sunset, neon lights fading into the gold of evening. Across oceans, cities mirrored this moment, lights glimmering, people walking, conversations unfolding. The world was vast, complex, and imperfect. And yet, interconnected. Humanity, everywhere, was part of the same story, of revelation, response, and consequence. And maybe, he realized, that is the essential truth: power can be exposed, systems can tremble, and influence can shift. But human choice, amplified across time and space, is the true agent of change. He whispered to himself, softly, across continents and cultures. Awareness travels farther than any headline. And the world listened, quietly, knowingly, inevitably. She sat alone in her apartment, the city lights spilling through the blinds. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the phone, staring at messages she hadn't expected. Emails, texts, notifications, every ping a reminder that nothing would ever be the same. The revelation had reached her world, personally, intimately. Her career, once steady, now balanced on a delicate thread. Colleagues who had been allies glanced with suspicion. Friends she had trusted questioned her judgment. Even family hesitated before asking simple questions. Trust, it seemed, had become scarce. And yet, there was clarity. A subtle, hard-won clarity that comes only when chaos strips away illusion. She understood that consequences are the cost of awareness, and that courage, once exercised, cannot be unchosen. Across the city, he faced a different kind of consequence. Not public scrutiny, not political maneuvering, but a quiet reckoning within himself. Every choice he had made during the storm, every calculated risk, every decision to speak or stay silent, returned to him in reflection. Success and failure intertwined, indistinguishable until he confronted the human cost. People around him reacted unpredictably. Some withdrew, fearing association. Some pressed closer, seeking guidance, reassurance, or alliance. And in those interactions, the subtle weight of human consequence became tangible. Power, exposure, revelation, they are not abstract. They live inside people, shaping decisions, emotions, and relationships. He watched as a mentor he had long respected struggled quietly. Their silence had been strategic, protective, but now it felt heavy with moral compromise. The revelation had pierced the veneer of control. And the cost of that silence was personal: sleepless nights, uneasy conversations, a gnawing awareness of what might have been different. She remembered moments from her past that suddenly felt like preparation. Every choice, every instinct, every lesson seemed to converge in this moment of consequence. She realized that the storm, though external, had always been internal as well. Ordinary citizens faced consequences too. A single misstep in judgment, a poorly timed comment online, a refusal to question authority, these small human acts had ripple effects that extended far beyond individual perception. And yet, some seized the moment to act boldly, ethically, courageously. These were the moments that would quietly shape the future. The personal toll of revelation is often invisible. It is not captured in headlines, not summarized in pundit analysis. It lives in the sleepless nights, in the quiet doubt, in the subtle realignment of values and priorities. It is human, intimate, unavoidable. A journalist he had followed for years now faced a crisis. Her reporting, once celebrated, was scrutinized through the lens of the storm. Questions arose about sources, ethics, and perspective. And yet, her resolve hardened. Consequence sharpened her clarity. Courage, when measured against accountability, revealed its true form. He reflected on a universal truth: awareness is powerful, but it is costly. Knowledge changes the observer, just as it changes society. The storm had lifted a veil, but the light illuminated both opportunity and consequence. And human beings, in all their complexity, navigate both imperfectly. In a quiet neighborhood, a teacher received an email from a parent, questioning the way events were being discussed in class. The teacher paused, considered the implications, and responded with honesty. It was a small act, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Consequence is often measured not in headlines, but in integrity maintained when no one is watching. Every individual now carried a fragment of the revelation, a shard of truth that demanded response. Some would embrace it. Some would resist. Some would ignore it. And in that spectrum of human behavior, the landscape of consequence unfolded. He thought about how personal consequences often intersect with professional stakes. A simple decision to act ethically or strategically could ripple into career, relationships, and public perception. And yet, these moments define human character more reliably than any headline or accolade. She felt a quiet pride, not for recognition, not for power, but for the knowledge that she had chosen courage over comfort. That in the face of complexity, uncertainty, and risk, she had acted in alignment with her understanding of truth. And that, she realized, mattered more than any external reward. The city around them pulsed with life, oblivious in some ways, aware in others. Consequence, like an invisible river, flowed through every street, every building, every interaction. It connected the global, the societal, and the personal in a pattern subtle yet undeniable. He paused to consider the moral dimension. Every human action in the wake of revelation carries consequence. Choices made in fear may be expedient, but they have cost. Choices made in courage may be risky, but they ripple outward, altering perception, culture, and human behavior. And in that reflection, he saw the beauty of human resilience. Consequence is inevitable, but human response is variable. People falter, people succeed, people act, people hesitate. And through it all, character emerges, quietly, persistently, unmistakably. She walked through the city streets at night, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. Each phase she passed carried an untold story of consequence, decisions weighed, fears managed, courage exercised. The revelation had transformed more than policy, headlines, or systems. It had transformed people. He thought about the moments when courage intersects with consequence. A single choice can change perception, alter relationships, inspire action, or preserve integrity. And often, the smallest choices carry the greatest weight. In that quiet understanding, he whispered to himself, softly. Courage is measured in the consequences we endure. The human cost of revelation is real. It is intimate. It is persistent. It shapes identity, relationships, and understanding. And yet, it is in facing consequence with integrity that humanity asserts its enduring value. The city breathed around them, unaware of the internal storms carried by its citizens. Neon glimmered like fragmented reflections of choice. Rain pooled in the streets, shimmering with the light of awareness. And in the quiet, intimate moments of human reckoning, the ripple effects of the storm continued to spread. She realized finally that consequence is not punishment. It is not reward. It is the mirror of action, reflecting choices, intentions, and courage. And in that reflection, she saw the possibility for growth, resilience, and transformation. And he understood, in the hum of the city and the quiet of observation, the personal is inseparable from the societal. Each choice matters. Each decision carries weight. Each act of courage or cowardice ripples outward, shaping history in ways small and profound. He whispered again, for the listener, for himself, for anyone awake to the truth. Every action leaves a mark on the world. The storm had unsettled everything. Walls that once seemed permanent now appeared porous. Alliances that had been assumed unbreakable wavered. And in that instability, something remarkable emerged, the unexpected. He noticed it first in a quiet hallway, away from the cameras, the microphones, and the blinking notifications. Two figures, long considered adversaries, spoke in hushed tones. Their words were measured, deliberate, almost cautious. Yet beneath the surface, the tension held a new possibility: cooperation. At first, it was tentative. A gesture here. A nod there. Small signals indicating openness, willingness, perhaps necessity. When revelation shakes power, old divisions can collapse as quickly as trust can erode. Across the city, similar patterns appeared. Individuals, teams, even institutions began to explore collaboration that would have been impossible weeks ago. Suspicion remained, but necessity and awareness created openings. He reflected on the human dimension. Alliances are rarely formed in ideal conditions. They emerge when risk is high, when stakes are personal, when consequences demand recalibration. Cooperation, in its rawest form, is survival, and survival awakens ingenuity, empathy, and courage. One meeting exemplified the phenomenon. Representatives from rival factions convened in a discreet office. At first, conversation circled around logistics, influence, reputation. But gradually, personal stories surfaced. Moments of shared concern. Recognition of mutual vulnerability. The revelation had leveled the playing field, not by making them equal, but by exposing shared humanity. Across the political spectrum, pragmatism met morality. Calculated compromise met ethical risk. The storm demanded choice, and choice demanded collaboration, however uneasy or temporary. He observed microsignals of trust forming. A handshake. An acknowledgement of expertise. A subtle concession of authority. These small moments carried enormous weight, the scaffolding for alliances that could shape policy, perception, and consequence. Even those skeptical of cooperation began to adapt. Hardliners learned that isolation could be fatal. Moderates realized that bridging gaps might yield leverage. And behind the scenes, advisors calculated both risk and opportunity, aware that alliances could stabilize influence or accelerate exposure. At a community level, collaboration took different forms. Activists who once competed for attention began sharing platforms, amplifying voices, and strategizing collectively. Volunteers coordinated quietly, pooling resources for transparency campaigns. Even ordinary citizens, previously disengaged, found alignment in shared purpose. He noted the philosophical resonance: cooperation emerges most vividly in crisis. Fear can divide, yes, but necessity and awareness create bridges. Human beings, in the face of exposure, demonstrate both ingenuity and resilience. And in those alliances, fragile, tentative, human, hope begins to appear. The story unfolded like this: individuals aware of consequence seek partners, not for loyalty alone, but for shared understanding. Trust is provisional. Risk is constant. And yet, human beings persist in connection, even when the future is uncertain. He witnessed the subtle tension within these alliances. Each participant calculated advantage, weighed vulnerability, and monitored perception. Collaboration is rarely pure. It is a mixture of strategy and empathy, self-interest and sacrifice, fear and courage. And in that mixture, profound outcomes emerge. A journalist documented meetings between unlikely partners, noting both friction and synergy. Her reporting captured not just politics, but human negotiation, the delicate dance of ego, fear, insight, and courage. Through her lens, the alliances became living proof that revelation reshapes human behavior in unpredictable ways. He saw personal alliances forming too. Friends who had once disagreed on principle discovered shared concern. Rivals found common ground in ethical conviction. Families, workplaces, neighborhoods, microcosms of larger systems, began reflecting the same patterns. Cooperation became a survival strategy, a moral choice, a reflection of awareness. And yet, danger remained. Alliances can fracture as quickly as they form. Miscommunication, miscalculation, and ego can undo progress in an instant. The machine, though weakened, still exerted pressure, testing loyalty, probing for weakness, and exploiting hesitation. Every collaboration carried inherent risk. He paused, considering the paradox. Revelation exposes truth, but truth alone cannot secure change. Cooperation amplifies potential, but only if participants navigate tension, fear, and ego with awareness. And in this delicate balance, human choice becomes both weapon and shield. One unexpected alliance demonstrated courage in action. Two individuals, historically opposed, coordinated a joint initiative aimed at transparency and accountability. Risk was high. Reputation hung in the balance. Yet, each recognized that cooperation could achieve far more than isolation, silence, or hostility. He realized then that alliances, though temporary, create lasting ripple effects. Even if fractured later, the experience of collaboration reshapes perspective, builds empathy, and models courage. It is not the permanence of partnership that matters, but the human insight gained through engagement. In a quiet cafe, he observed another microcosm, a coalition of volunteers from different neighborhoods pooling knowledge and resources to fact-check information circulating in the wake of the revelation. Their alliance was small, almost invisible, yet profoundly human, a demonstration of courage, ingenuity, and shared responsibility. The philosophical insight crystallized: alliances, unexpected or otherwise, are born from necessity, awareness, and shared consequence. They are not merely strategic. They are deeply human. And they illuminate the capacity for connection, even amid uncertainty and fear. Back in the corridors of power, the political chessboard shifted subtly. Opponents exchanged nods. Rivals tolerated advice. Leaders accepted input from unanticipated sources. And in those moments, the storm revealed both vulnerability and possibility. He reflected on history: the greatest transformations often emerge from fragile alliances formed in crisis. Small acts of trust, cooperation, and courage accumulate. Fragmented systems find coherence. Human connection becomes the lever that shifts perception, behavior, and ultimately, consequence. The city pulsed with life outside the rooms where alliances formed. Neon lights shimmered in puddles. Conversations continued. Decisions multiplied. And every small act of collaboration, however quiet, carried weight beyond its immediate scope. She realized, finally, that alliances are not about certainty or control. They are about courage, reflection, and the willingness to risk consequence for shared purpose. In that recognition lies both hope and responsibility. He whispered to the listener, softly, over the hum of the city. Even fractured alliances can change the world. The city seemed to hold its breath. Not literally. Not visibly. But every street, every office, every home carried a sense of something shifting, a current running beneath the surface, quiet but unstoppable. People sensed it before they could name it. Awareness had reached critical mass. It started small. Social media posts, threads connecting dots, questions forming faster than answers. Then came gatherings. In cafes, at parks, in office lobbies, strangers discussed what had previously been private concern. Curiosity became insistence. Concern became outrage. And the revelation, once distant, became immediate. Newsrooms lit up. Editors scrambled to track stories, verify claims, and keep pace with the flood of information. Television networks interrupted programming. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to analysis. Every platform, every channel, every outlet became a node in the expanding web of consciousness. He watched as ordinary people began to act. They organized meetings, launched fact-check initiatives, posted evidence, and questioned authority. The tipping point was not a single event. It was the cumulative effect of millions of small, human choices, awareness multiplied by courage. The machine felt it too. Calculated strategies faltered. Influence waned. Attempts at obfuscation were exposed almost immediately by collective vigilance. For the first time, power encountered a force it could not fully control, mass human consciousness aware, questioning, and refusing passivity. In government offices, the tension was palpable. Advisors whispered in corridors. Officials recalculated risk. Decisions that once could be delayed indefinitely now demanded immediate attention. The storm was no longer abstract, it was tangible, urgent, unavoidable. He observed something remarkable: the tipping point was not chaotic. It was rhythmic, organic, human. People moved in waves, responding not out of blind emotion but through reflection, courage, and an instinct for justice. Awareness had matured into action. At town halls, citizens asked questions they had once feared. Reporters pressed for accountability with renewed vigor. Whistleblowers found support, amplified by networks they hadn't imagined. Transparency spread like a pulse, reaching corners previously hidden from scrutiny. Even in workplaces, subtle shifts occurred. Managers listened differently. Teams debated more openly. Colleagues shared information previously withheld. The storm had reached private spaces, quietly transforming culture, communication, and decision-making. He reflected on the philosophical dimension: tipping points are less about spectacle and more about accumulation. Change emerges when awareness, courage, and consequence intersect. When ordinary actions, repeated and amplified, create momentum impossible to ignore. Across the city, and across the nation, the pattern repeated. Public demonstrations grew, not violent, but insistent. Citizens demanded clarity, transparency, and accountability. Social pressure became a catalyst, translating human consciousness into tangible consequence. He noticed micro-moments that would have gone unnoticed in ordinary times. A clerk refusing to follow a misleading directive. A teacher addressing misinformation in class. A neighbor organizing a local discussion group. Each small act, multiplied across millions, contributed to the tidal wave of awareness. The media captured fragments: a protest here, a speech there, a viral post trending nationally. But the real tipping point existed in private consciousness, the realization that truth matters, that silence has cost, that human choice is active, not passive. He paused to reflect on fear. The machine tried to resist the tide, employing intimidation, distraction, and misdirection. Yet fear, when confronted collectively, loses potency. Courage, amplified by awareness, becomes irresistible. One significant moment crystallized the tipping point. A prominent figure, previously silent, addressed the nation directly. Not with speeches rehearsed for optics, but with honesty, acknowledging the storm, the revelation, and the human responsibility to respond. The statement reverberated across social media, news outlets, and ordinary households. Momentum shifted perceptibly. Ordinary citizens felt empowered. Their voices mattered. Their actions contributed. Awareness had reached critical mass. Humanity, collectively conscious, could now alter the course of events in ways previously unimaginable. He observed the subtle interplay between individual courage and collective action. One could inspire thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions. One act of clarity, when multiplied, becomes movement. The tipping point is never abstract, it is profoundly human. At night, the city glimmered with signs of change. Windows lit with conversations. Streets filled with gatherings. Phones buzzed with discussion, reflection, and planning. The storm had moved from political and institutional corridors to every living space, every heart, every mind. He reflected philosophically: tipping points are not instantaneous. They are the product of accumulation, awareness, reflection, and courage. And when they arrive, they are unstoppable not because of force, but because of alignment, human choice harmonizing with consequence. Across the nation, systems began responding. Officials could no longer ignore the scrutiny. Policies, statements, and actions shifted. Momentum, once invisible, manifested visibly. The storm was no longer a narrative confined to headlines. It had become lived experience, tangible and transformative. She walked through her neighborhood, observing subtle but undeniable changes. Conversations in coffee shops, discussions in libraries, engagement in public forums. People were awake. Alert. Conscious of impact. And she realized that the tipping point was not a singular moment, but a collective awakening. He watched history in miniature, repeated millions of times across the nation, ordinary human choices converging into visible consequence, transforming inertia into action, silence into dialogue, indifference into engagement. And as the city breathed with this new rhythm, he whispered to himself, softly, for anyone willing to listen. Awareness becomes unstoppable when we act. The tipping point had arrived. Not through coercion, not through spectacle, but through the quiet accumulation of courage, reflection, and human choice. The storm, once invisible, now reshaped reality. The machine had always seemed invincible. Impenetrable. Silent. Relentless. Yet, even the most well-oiled systems have weaknesses, and revelation has a way of exposing them. It started subtly. A miscalculation here. A delayed response there. A leaked memo, small in content but monumental in consequence. The machine shuddered, and for the first time, its operators realized the rules had changed. He observed the cracks forming. Not violent, not catastrophic. But undeniable. Coordination faltered. Messaging became inconsistent. Allies wavered. Doubt spread quietly, invisibly, like hairline fractures in glass. Inside the corridors of power, whispers became urgent conversations. Meetings that once required consent now faced hesitation. Decisions that once seemed automatic were debated with caution. Even the most loyal operatives questioned assumptions they had never considered. The machine, designed for control, struggled to adapt. Its usual mechanisms, influence, intimidation, distraction, were blunted by the sheer force of awareness. People were awake. Citizens, insiders, journalists, and whistleblowers acted in unison, not coordinated, but aligned. An alignment, even informal, creates force the machine cannot ignore. One minor leak created disproportionate impact. A document intended for internal circulation found its way to a journalist. The contents were mundane, technical, almost trivial, yet the context transformed it into a symbol of vulnerability. The machine's infallibility was questioned publicly. He noticed reactions in real time. Some tried to conceal. Others deflected. Some panicked. And some, quietly, began reconsidering their loyalty. The revelation had a contagion effect. Doubt spreads faster than certainty, and once it takes root, recovery is uncertain. In the shadows, alliances shifted. Operatives who had once been unquestioned enforcers of the system now weighed personal risk against institutional loyalty. The calculus of power had changed. Fear no longer guaranteed obedience. Awareness demanded choice. Ordinary citizens, too, noticed the cracks. Headlines hinted at instability. Commentary suggested vulnerability. Conversations in homes, cafes, and offices carried a subtle but undeniable theme: the system was not unassailable. People felt possibility, hope, and responsibility. A senator, historically considered untouchable, hesitated publicly for the first time. Their statements, once scripted, now betrayed subtle uncertainty. Advisors scrambled. The machine responded, slowly, imperfectly. Friction between protocol and reality created visible tension. He observed subtle fractures in media control. Narratives intended to reinforce stability stumbled under scrutiny. Fact-checkers amplified leaks. Analysts highlighted inconsistencies. The public perception of strength waned, exposing the machine to consequence. Even the most loyal insiders began questioning strategy. Some calculated personal survival, others considered moral responsibility. And in each decision, the human element emerged, unpredictably, courageously, devastatingly. The philosophical truth was clear: no system, however vast or powerful, can endure sustained awareness. Revelation is the solvent of control, patience the catalyst, and human choice the force that fractures even the strongest machinery. One moment crystallized the phenomenon. A previously obedient figure, long considered a loyalist, publicly contradicted the official narrative. Not dramatically, not in spectacle, but quietly, in measured language that betrayed confidence in personal conscience over institutional loyalty. The crack widened. He realized that cracks are cumulative. Small errors, human hesitation, individual courage, each adds a fracture line. And when they converge, collapse is not sudden, but inevitable. The machine, while massive, is also human at every hinge, every decision, every calculation. Across institutions, similar signs appeared. A misaligned memo, a delayed directive, a public rebuttal. The machine's usual precision faltered under the relentless weight of collective awareness. And in that faltering, people recognized opportunity, for reform, for transparency, for accountability. The city itself mirrored the instability. Streets moved with quiet tension. Offices hummed with anxious energy. Conversations carried subtext, careful observation, reflection. The storm had penetrated the human layer of the system. He noted a fundamental paradox: the machine depends on human execution. Policies, communications, strategies, all require people to act. Awareness disrupts obedience. And when obedience falters, the system's strength diminishes. Cracks appear where human choice intersects with structural rigidity. Even within the machine's inner circle, human conflict arose. Loyalty versus morality. Fear versus courage. Obedience versus awareness. Decisions that had once been automatic now required judgment. And judgment, human and imperfect, introduces variability, and therefore vulnerability. A journalist captured the first public signs. Conflicting statements, hesitant press conferences, subtle misalignment in messaging. The cracks were now visible beyond internal corridors. Citizens observed, questioned, and reacted. The machine's infallibility was exposed to collective consciousness. He reflected on the human truth embedded in systems: even the most powerful cannot escape the consequences of awareness. Control is fragile, authority contingent, and morality inevitable when revealed. And in that realization, courage becomes the lever that exploits cracks. In a quiet meeting room, a group of insiders debated next steps. Some advocated concealment, others transparency. The tension was thick, almost tangible. Each choice carried risk, and the weight of consequence pressed on every decision. And yet, human conscience began to influence strategy, subtly reshaping outcomes. The philosophical insight crystallized: cracks are not merely failures. They are opportunities. Exposure breeds reflection. Mistakes invite correction. And when courage meets awareness, systems adapt or fracture. He looked out at the city, neon lights reflecting in rain puddles, a quiet mirror of instability. Everywhere, small human decisions compounded into visible fracture. The machine, though massive, could not escape the ripple effect of choice. And in that awareness, he whispered to himself, softly, for anyone listening: even the strongest systems break where humans resist. The cracks had appeared. Subtle, yet undeniable. Invisible mechanisms faltered. The machine, once monolithic, revealed its human hinge points. And the storm, relentless, continued to shape consequence, perception, and moral reckoning. The city held its breath, again. But this time, the pause was heavier. Denser. More insistent. People felt it in their bones. Something had shifted. Not just the news, not just the headlines, not just the cracks in the machine, but the weight of consequence pressing on every human decision. He walked through streets illuminated by neon and streetlights, the hum of traffic underscoring the rhythm of thought. Every face told a story: recognition, hesitation, courage, fear. Ordinary people were grappling with extraordinary awareness. Inside offices and homes, conversations turned toward truth. Friends questioned one another. Families debated ethics. Colleagues navigated moral complexity. The revelation had transformed private spaces into arenas of reckoning. He thought of those who had stayed silent, who had deferred to convenience, authority, or fear. Their hesitation now became a burden, visible not in headlines but in conscience. The human mind does not easily forget what it has witnessed, the knowledge that systems can fail, that power can corrupt, and that silence carries consequence. A teacher confronted a class with the reality of revelation. Not politics, not ideology, but human responsibility. She asked, "What would you do if the world expected you to act with courage?" The question lingered longer than the lesson, embedding itself in thought, reflection, and conscience. He observed a whistleblower who had acted quietly, months before, now recognized for integrity. The acknowledgement was not about fame or reward, it was about moral clarity, the alignment of action with conscience. And in that recognition, courage became contagious. Ordinary citizens began small acts of accountability. Reporting inconsistencies. Questioning authority. Engaging in dialogue. Participating not out of protest alone, but out of awareness that personal choice now intersected with systemic consequence. Even within the machine, human conflict escalated. Advisors, once compliant, now hesitated. Loyalty collided with conscience. Fear collided with morality. Decisions became microcosms of the broader reckoning, each human choice magnified, multiplied, consequential. In one quiet office, two longtime rivals met. They argued, yes, but also listened. Each acknowledged errors, compromises, and moral lapses. They could not undo the past, but recognition, honest, human recognition, allowed alignment, cooperation, even fragile redemption. Across the city, the same pattern repeated: reflection, confrontation, acknowledgement, action. The storm, relentless, had forced humans to reconcile with the truth, their role, their responsibility. He noted the philosophical resonance: systems are ultimately human. Machines are operated by people. Rules are interpreted by people. Laws are enforced by people. And when humans face awareness of consequence, morality cannot be ignored indefinitely. The machine falters because humans act, or hesitate, in the space between knowledge and action. In homes, offices, cafes, streets, whispers became conversation. Conversations became debate. Debate became decisions. Decisions, small and large, shaped perception, culture, and momentum. The human reckoning was cumulative, persistent, unstoppable in its quiet insistence. A young activist confronted local authorities. Not with anger, but with evidence, clarity, and moral certainty. Officials paused, hesitated, recalculated. The act was small, nearly invisible, but in the context of collective awareness, it resonated. Courage, multiplied, amplifies consequence. He thought about personal confrontation with truth. Everyone faces moments when awareness demands action. Hesitation may protect comfort, but courage preserves conscience. And in times of systemic exposure, human conscience becomes the lever of transformation. At a neighborhood meeting, citizens shared personal stories of complicity, oversight, and awakening. Admission was not weakness. It was the first step toward accountability. Human reckoning is often uncomfortable, but discomfort precedes insight. He paused on a rooftop, watching the city pulse with life. Neon signs reflected in puddles. Traffic hummed. Conversations flowed. Awareness, consequence, courage, the elements of reckoning, had penetrated private and public spaces alike. In a hospital, a nurse quietly corrected a reporting error. In a classroom, a teacher confronted misleading information. In a newsroom, a reporter fact-checked a powerful figure. These small acts, often unseen, carried enormous moral weight. The storm had reached its human epicenter. He realized that reckoning is never neat. It is messy, slow, persistent. It is felt in conscience, observed in action, and amplified through consequence. Humans are both flawed and courageous. And in the tension between these forces, change manifests. A public figure, previously celebrated for loyalty, now publicly acknowledged mistakes. Their words were measured, reflective, human. They could not erase the past, but they demonstrated that awareness can guide moral action. The cracks in the machine intersected with courage, producing tangible, visible effect. He noted the universality of human reckoning. Across socio-economic strata, across political affiliation, across geography, the pattern repeated: reflection, acknowledgement, action. The storm, though politically framed, had become profoundly human. At night, the city seemed quieter. Not in absence, but in intensity. Awareness settled into the spaces between streetlights, between conversations, between decisions. Human reckoning is silent until it manifests in courage. And the city held that tension like a collective heartbeat. He whispered, softly, as if across every rooftop, every living room, every office. Conscience awakens where truth is undeniable. People began connecting the dots. Small acts of courage inspired others. Personal confrontation became collective momentum. The human reckoning had a rhythm: question, reflect, act, endure. Each iteration strengthened awareness, morality, and consequence. He understood the cinematic truth: the storm is not only revealed in headlines or political fallout. It is felt in the human heart, enacted in ordinary spaces, multiplied in courage, and cemented in conscience. The reckoning is personal and societal, intimate and global. She walked through empty streets after midnight. The glow of neon reflected her own awareness back at her. She understood that the storm was not over. It would continue, ripple, grow. But she also recognized her role: to act, to witness, to persist. Reckoning is incomplete without human engagement. And finally, he whispered again, for the listener, for the awakened, for anyone willing to confront truth. Awareness demands action, and action defines us. Every revolution of awareness invites resistance. It is inevitable. Natural. Human systems push back when exposed. And now, after months of revelation and reckoning, the backlash began. Not with explosions, not with spectacle. That comes later, sometimes. This backlash was quiet, calculated, insidious. Subtle shifts in media narratives, targeted messaging, carefully leaked information. Pressure applied where compliance seemed weakest, doubt seeded where courage had grown. He noticed it in office corridors. Whispered conversations, meetings convened not to solve problems but to redirect perception. A misalignment here, a recalibrated strategy there. The machine had adapted, not entirely, but enough to resist. Across the city, individuals felt subtle coercion. Invitations to conform, warnings couched as advice, reputations subtly undermined. Fear resurfaced, this time calibrated to exploit awareness. Courage would be tested. Morality measured against survival. In homes, the backlash manifested differently. Social pressure, skepticism, even ridicule. Those who had spoken out faced resistance from friends and family, reminders that standing up carries cost. The human psyche is often the first battlefield of resistance. He reflected on the philosophy: backlash is a mirror. It reflects power's persistence and human fragility. Resistance does not always attack openly, it often manipulates perception, bending morality toward convenience. And confronting it requires vigilance, insight, and courage. One journalist experienced it directly. Praise for earlier courage transformed into subtle questioning. Questions of credibility. Doubts of motivation. Attempts to discredit without direct confrontation. Awareness becomes contested, morality challenged, courage tested. Even within political circles, backlash was systematic. Advisors pushed narratives designed to slow momentum. Public figures delivered statements calibrated to confuse, delay, or divide. Policy proposals surfaced not to solve, but to distract. The machine had learned to adapt to exposure. Yet, the human spirit persisted. Small acts of courage, repeated across networks of awareness, counteracted subtle resistance. Each fact checked, each conversation held, each moral choice made became a counterweight to the tide of backlash. He noted the emotional dimension. Backlash generates fear, doubt, and hesitation. It challenges identity, loyalty, and purpose. But it also illuminates the value of courage. Without resistance, bravery has no measure. Without opposition, awareness cannot consolidate. Across neighborhoods, communities, workplaces, and media outlets, the tension was palpable. Every action faced scrutiny. Every choice encountered subtle pressure. And yet, human conscience persisted, quietly asserting influence. A public figure once loyal to the machine now faced a personal test. Do they bend under pressure, or do they act in alignment with conscience? The city watched, not openly, not in spectacle, but in quiet perception. Humans notice integrity, even when subtle. Backlash was not uniform. Some resisted with blunt force, intimidation, threats, overt pressure. Others employed subtler strategies, persuasion, distraction, narrative control. All aimed to reclaim influence, restore perception of control, and delay inevitable consequence. He realized a crucial truth: awareness provokes backlash precisely because it threatens established systems. Courage challenges convenience. Truth destabilizes control. Human choice disrupts expectation. And when the system reacts, it reveals both its fragility and its persistence. Ordinary citizens experienced micro-backlash too. Ridicule from colleagues. Skepticism from peers. Online attacks disguised as debate. Every small act of defiance invited response, and every response tested resolve. Awareness was no longer passive, it demanded endurance. He reflected philosophically: backlash is the proving ground. It separates superficial awareness from deep moral engagement. It measures the resilience of conscience. And it defines the capacity of ordinary humans to sustain courage under pressure. In a quiet cafe, a group of allies strategized. They faced subtle sabotage, misdirection, and attempts to fracture their cohesion. Yet, they persisted. Awareness combined with collaboration generated strength stronger than fear or coercion. Together, they counteracted the machine's subtle manipulations. Even as pressure mounted, small victories reinforced human resolve. A misstep by a manipulator became widely noted. A truth once suppressed surfaced publicly. Courage multiplied, subtly reshaping momentum. Backlash was strong, but human awareness proved resilient. The city itself seemed to pulse in response. Street conversations, online discourse, even casual interactions reflected the push and pull between resistance and courage. Awareness met opposition. Morality faced challenge. Courage encountered tests. And humans, in millions of small acts, persisted. He thought about history: every meaningful awakening has encountered backlash. Every societal shift faces resistance. And yet, humanity persists. Awareness endures. Courage emerges. The cycle is relentless but illuminating. One moment crystallized the phenomenon: a community meeting convened to confront systemic mismanagement. Authorities arrived, attempting to influence narrative subtly, to redirect focus, to calm outrage. Citizens, aware and prepared, resisted manipulation calmly but firmly. The balance had shifted. Resistance collided with collective awareness, producing tension, insight, and public clarity. He realized that backlash, though formidable, is also revealing. It exposes vulnerability. It clarifies intent. It measures commitment. And for those awake to consequence, it becomes a teacher, a mirror, and a proving ground. At night, the city's neon lights reflected in rain puddles, fractured and shimmering. The scene mirrored the human struggle, resistance and courage intertwined, tension oscillating, consequence unfolding. Awareness had provoked opposition, but awareness persisted. He whispered softly, across streets, homes, offices, for anyone willing to listen. Resistance proves the value of courage. The backlash had begun, predictable but formidable. Fear resurfaced, manipulation spread, and systems pushed to reclaim control. Yet, the storm of awareness had grown beyond containment. Human courage, multiplied and persistent, met every test. Even under pressure, ordinary citizens, journalists, activists, and insiders realized a profound truth: awareness is not enough. Action is required. Conscience must persist. Morality must assert itself in the face of resistance. And in that tension, cinematic and human, he understood, the true battle is not spectacle. It is subtle, intimate, relentless. It exists in conscience, in choice, in perseverance. The storm endures. The reckoning continues. And humanity remains the decisive force. The storm had tested everyone. Citizens, insiders, journalists, and even those once loyal to the machine had faced hesitation, doubt, and subtle pressure. Fear lingered like a shadow. Resistance pushed back with precision. Yet, something remarkable began to unfold, a turning point. It started with small, deliberate actions. A whistleblower's testimony validated by a journalist. A community initiative that exposed systemic inconsistency. Legal filings that challenged long-standing protocols. Individually modest, collectively transformative. He observed the subtle but undeniable pattern. Awareness, courage, and persistence intersected in ways the machine could not counter. Every act of moral clarity chipped at control. Every collective decision amplified consequence. And suddenly, momentum shifted. Across the city, ordinary citizens sensed change. Streets filled with quiet activity, meetings, discussions, outreach. Not protests in the traditional sense, but organized, informed, persistent human engagement. Awareness had moved from observation into action. Inside offices of power, tension escalated. Advisors and operatives realized that traditional strategies of control no longer sufficed. Attempts to manipulate perception faltered. Attempts to suppress truth failed. Human choice had multiplied beyond their calculations. He noted the philosophical resonance: transformation begins not with authority, but with individuals acting in concert. The tipping point of awareness met the persistent force of courage. The machine, vast and disciplined, now encountered the unpredictable and relentless force of humanity. A journalist captured a defining moment. Public disclosure of previously concealed information, verified and contextualized, reached millions. Media outlets, independent and mainstream, amplified it. Citizens engaged, debated, and acted. The first irreversible cracks appeared. Even within previously loyal institutions, unexpected shifts occurred. Leaders began acknowledging reality. Policies were reconsidered. Advisors recommended transparency, not obfuscation. The machine, constrained by its own internal friction, began yielding to consequence. He observed the human element magnifying systemic impact. Courage inspired courage. Small, quiet actions reinforced other actions. Awareness became infectious, spreading not through coercion, but through observation, inspiration, and moral clarity. One moment crystallized the turning point. Two previously opposed leaders coordinated a public initiative aimed at transparency. It was symbolic and practical. Acknowledgement, verification, action, all intertwined. The public witnessed unity born of courage, not convenience. Momentum became tangible. Across neighborhoods and institutions, patterns repeated. Education initiatives, civic engagement, investigative journalism, community activism, all converged into coherent human action. The machine struggled to respond. Its traditional levers of power proved insufficient against coordinated, morally grounded awareness. He reflected philosophically, the turning point is not sudden. It is cumulative. It emerges from persistence, courage, and the relentless engagement of human conscience. The city itself seemed to pulse with new energy. Neon reflected collective determination. Rain-slicked streets carried footsteps of purpose. Conversations, debates, initiatives, all signaled the irreversible momentum of human agency. He noted microtensions resolving into macro-movement. Previously fractured alliances coordinated initiatives. Individuals who had hesitated now acted decisively. Collective awareness crystallized into deliberate, sustained action. The storm had reached a new phase, transformation. Even those resistant to change recognized it. Advisors recalculated, operatives hesitated, leaders adjusted. Momentum, once merely human and unpredictable, now exerted systemic influence. The machine had shifted from dominance to adaptation. He paused on a rooftop, observing the interplay of human choice and systemic consequence. Awareness multiplied courage. Courage shaped decision. Decision altered structure. Structure yielded to persistence. Transformation, irreversible and human, was underway. At a community center, a grassroots coalition coordinated efforts to verify public records. Their work, meticulous and persistent, exposed inconsistencies previously hidden. Officials responded, policies shifted, and trust, fragile but present, began to realign. He understood a fundamental truth: systemic change requires human persistence. Authority yields not simply to revelation, but to sustained, morally grounded action. The turning point is achieved when courage intersects with consequence repeatedly, cumulatively, irrevocably. A single act of moral clarity, observed, shared, and reinforced, can cascade across society. A city, a state, a nation, all can be reshaped when individuals act in concert, guided by awareness, reflection, and courage. In offices, journalists debated strategy. Citizens engaged in dialogue. Teachers addressed uncomfortable truths. Families confronted complicity. Across society, action multiplied consequence, producing tangible transformation. He whispered softly, for anyone listening, across rooftops, living rooms, offices. Courage, when persistent, reshapes reality. The turning point was not a spectacle. It was a human, quiet, relentless convergence of awareness and action. The storm continued, but now it carried a direction, toward transparency, accountability, and the assertion of conscience. He watched as a previously silent figure addressed the public, acknowledging error, revealing truth, and advocating accountability. Citizens responded not just with attention, but with participation. Momentum became tangible. Human action had overcome subtle resistance, producing irreversible impact. And in that cinematic, tense, profoundly human moment, he reflected: systems may resist. Machines may exert pressure. Backlash may persist. But the accumulation of morally guided, courageous human action is unstoppable. The city trembled, quietly. Not from storms or sirens, but from the weight of consequence pressing down on every corner, every office, every home. The human reckoning had arrived, fully, unmistakably, undeniable. Every action, every choice, every act of courage had coalesced. The turning point had passed, and now the consequences could no longer be ignored. The machine, once confident, disciplined, unyielding, faced the culmination of human persistence. He observed it in corridors of power. Statements once rehearsed now faltered. Policies once ironclad were reconsidered. Advisors who had relied on fear and manipulation now hesitated, aware that authority alone could no longer dictate outcome. Citizens were no longer merely aware. They were engaged. Watching. acting, demanding accountability. Their collective voice, persistent, precise, unrelenting, produced systemic tremors. The gears of power, long insulated from conscience, now responded to it. Across the city, media outlets, journalists, and activists documented, verified, amplified. Each revelation, each public acknowledgement, each disclosure reinforced the tide. The reckoning was cumulative, inevitable, and human. He saw the cracks widen. Leaders publicly confronted past mistakes. Officials recalibrated priorities. The machine adapted not out of choice, but necessity. Transparency became unavoidable. Action became imperative. Even those previously loyal to authority faced internal collapse. Fear clashed with morality. Loyalty collided with conscience. Hesitation became visible. The human cost of inaction was now undeniable. The philosophical truth was stark: power is contingent, authority fragile, and conscience unstoppable when amplified by collective action. The reckoning is human, systemic, and moral all at once. One act crystallized the climax. A coalition of insiders, journalists, and citizens exposed systemic failures, publicly and verifiably. Policy shifted. Accountability was demanded. Individuals previously shielded by bureaucracy were forced to respond. Courage had intersected with consequence, producing irreversible outcome. He noticed subtle signs of personal reckoning. People reflected on prior complicity, silence, or hesitation. Some sought to make amends. Others faced consequences with humility. Human awareness, long dormant or dormant by choice, asserted itself fully. Neighborhoods hummed with engagement. Meetings, initiatives, conversations, all reflected alignment between conscience and action. Ordinary citizens realized they had helped shape reality. Their courage, accumulated, had altered systems. In offices, corridors, and institutions, the machine's mechanisms faltered. Influence, manipulation, and control had limits. Human choice, multiplied, surpassed them. The reckoning was not revenge, not spectacle, but truth manifest. He observed subtle victories everywhere: a public figure acknowledged error, a policy was corrected, a misrepresented truth was clarified. None dramatic, all cumulative. And together, they created transformation. Even in private spaces, the reckoning persisted. Families, friends, colleagues confronted complicity and choice. Conversations once avoided became essential. Reflection turned into action. Accountability seeped into daily life. The storm had shifted from abstract revelation to lived consequence. Human conscience, amplified by persistence, had reshaped systems, culture, and perception. The machine was no longer dominant, it was responsive, vulnerable, and constrained by morality. One journalist captured the essence: truth cannot be hidden when human persistence seeks it. Courage cannot be silenced when conscience demands it. Awareness cannot be suppressed when action multiplies its force. Across the city, neon lights shimmered in rain puddles, fractured reflections mirroring fractured authority, yet unified human determination. Streets pulsed with quiet intensity. Conversations echoed moral awakening. Momentum was visible, tangible, irreversible. He reflected philosophically: the reckoning is not an event. It is the intersection of human choice, consequence, and moral courage. Systems yield not to spectacle, but to sustained human action aligned with conscience. And when that intersection occurs, transformation is irreversible. Even as backlash lingered, its power had diminished. Resistance was now countered by experience, awareness, and courage. The human force, persistent and morally grounded, had shifted the balance. In a small office, a previously hesitant figure took public responsibility, acknowledging missteps and committing to transparency. Their action, courageous in context, rippled through networks, inspiring similar acts across the city. Individual courage, multiplied, produced systemic consequence. He whispered softly, for anyone listening, across rooftops, streets, homes. Action aligned with conscience changes everything. The storm had reached its human and systemic apex. Awareness, courage, and action had intersected. The machine, once perceived as invincible, had been reshaped by the persistent force of humanity. The city exhaled, quietly. Not in relief, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. The reckoning was realized. Not perfectly. Not completely. But undeniably. He observed subtle transformations, transparency policies adopted, systems recalibrated, individuals re-engaged with moral responsibility. The consequences of human persistence were now embedded in institutions, culture, and conscience. Even ordinary citizens sensed it. Their participation mattered. Their courage mattered. Their choices had altered outcomes. The storm, once a force of revelation, had become a force of consequence. He understood finally that the cinematic truth is not in spectacle, but in subtle, persistent transformation. The reckoning was human, moral, systemic, and profoundly alive. And in that quiet, reflective moment, he whispered one last time, cinematic and eternal, for anyone willing to hear. Courage aligned with truth is unstoppable. The city was quiet, but not silent. The storm had passed, yet its echo lingered. Neon lights reflected on rain-slicked streets, shimmering like memories of tension, courage, and consequence. The reckoning had reshaped systems, shifted consciousness, and revealed truths once hidden. People moved differently now. Conversations carried weight. Choices were made with awareness. Courage, once tested, had become habitual. Morality, once deferred, was now recognized as indispensable. Life continued, but it was no longer the same life. He walked slowly through streets that had witnessed struggle and awakening. Cafes hummed with discussion, parks with reflection, offices with purposeful action. Ordinary humans, collectively aware, had altered the city, and the system, quietly but irreversibly. Inside homes, families reflected. Parents spoke to children about courage, consequence, and moral choice. Friends acknowledged past hesitation, sought understanding, and affirmed commitment to integrity. Awareness, once abstract, had become woven into daily life. He observed subtle victories everywhere, misrepresented truths corrected, systems recalibrated, policies reformed. Change had not been perfect. Transformation is rarely perfect. But it was human, moral, and enduring. The machine still existed. Its gears still turned. Its influence lingered. But it had been reshaped, constrained by the force of human persistence and conscience. Systems adapt when confronted by courage, and the machine had learned that lesson. In quiet offices, insiders reflected. They had faced fear, hesitation, and moral challenge. They had acted, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes boldly. Their choices, multiplied, had contributed to the irreversible transformation. The human element had prevailed. Across the city, ordinary citizens carried their awareness into new spaces. Conversations at cafes, classrooms, workplaces, and public forums reflected engagement, responsibility, and moral clarity. Awareness was now a force embedded in daily life. He paused atop a building, looking down at the streets below. Rain fell gently, washing the city in quiet reflection. Neon lights shimmered like tiny stars, mirrored in puddles. The world had shifted, subtly, profoundly, humanly. The philosophical truth was clear: freedom is not granted. Integrity is not automatic. Courage is not guaranteed. These are choices, moment by moment, decision by decision. Human awareness, coupled with persistent action, sustains them. A teacher in a classroom spoke softly to her students: your choices matter. Your voice matters. What you do, even quietly, can change everything. And for once, the lesson was not hypothetical. It was lived experience, woven into the fabric of society. Even in politics, the tone had changed. Public figures acknowledged mistakes, embraced transparency, and acted with moral clarity. The system had been exposed, challenged, and reshaped, not destroyed, but humanized. He realized the quiet, enduring beauty of this: transformation does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it persists in small acts repeated across millions of hearts. And sometimes, it leaves a city, a nation, a society, changed forever, subtly, profoundly, humanly. Citizens walked streets aware of consequence, reflective of choice, and ready for responsibility. Courage, awareness, and action had intersected. Momentum had become moral, systemic, and enduring. He reflected on the emotional arc of the journey. From revelation, to tension, to exposure, to human reckoning, to resistance, to turning point, to systemic change, the story had been cinematic not because of spectacle, but because of the human truths embedded at every step. Even as life continued, he noted lingering questions, subtle challenges, and ongoing responsibility. Transformation is not a destination. It is a process. Awareness requires maintenance. Courage requires repetition. Integrity requires vigilance. In quiet moments, people reflected. What had been revealed would never be unseen. What had been tested would never be ignored. What had been acted upon would shape choices for years, perhaps generations. The city, though calm, carried the echo of storms past. Every conversation, every choice, every act of courage was part of the lasting imprint. Change had occurred. It had been human. And it had been real. He whispered one last time, for anyone willing to listen. Freedom isn't guaranteed, it's chosen. Across streets, offices, homes, classrooms, cafes, the whisper resonated. Small acts of courage, repeated across millions, had reshaped systems, culture, and perception. Transformation had endured, not through force, but through humanity. And finally, softly, like a truth passed between one conscience and another, he added. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The city exhaled. Not in celebration. Not in relief. But in acknowledgement. The storm had passed, the reckoning had been realized, and humanity, persistent, aware, courageous, had endured. He looked down at the streets one last time. Neon lights reflected rain, shimmering with infinite possibility. The city was alive. Human. Moral. Courageous. And in that cinematic, reflective, profoundly human moment, he knew, stories end, but consequences endure. Awareness persists. Courage continues. And the light, quiet, enduring, human, shines on.